Chapter 468. Enters the true martial secret territory. It seemed as if there wasn't any harm in joining this organization. There wasn't any pressure of completing the task. Moreover, he also had the option of completing the tasks and accumulating the points whenever he required extra resources. In short, there was freedom. However, Yi Shiwen also understood that the opposite party would give exciting offers to incite him into completing the missions if they were daring to pledge such a condition. However, this wasn't a bad thing either. Giving an alternative option wasn't a bad thing. Moreover, your sworn enemy, the first god, has joined another organization. And that organization is named the Southern Dipper. He may cause you some trouble in the future. Qing Su faintly added. Yi Shiwen's pupils suddenly contracted. He had always been very concerned about the first god's whereabouts. He hadn't cared about the army of God at first. However, he had understood that there was someone very powerful in the army of God. When the second god had made an appearance, the second god had also caused a considerable amount of trouble to him. This obviously indicated that the first god must be more powerful since he was above the second god in ranking. However, Yi Shiwen had never heard any news of him. But he hadn't thought that he would get this news from Qing Su. What kind of an organization was the Southern Dipper organization? It must be an extraordinary organization if Qing Su had mentioned it in such a serious manner. People of the rank of Qing Su had joined the Northern Dipper organization. So this organization was undoubtedly an extremely terrifying one. Northern Dipper and Southern Dipper. Why do they sound so similar? Yi Shiwen was silent for a while. Then he suddenly grinned and asked, "Yes, there is some connection. However, there's no need for you to know these things at this time. You will slowly get to know these things if you join our organization. I'm asking you again, will you join?" The tall man replied impatiently. It was evident that he didn't wish to give more explanations to Yi Shiwen. Wood Dragon, don't get too impatient. He will probably become your partner in the future. Qing Su laughed and spoke. He seemed quite familiar with Wood Dragon's nature. Wood Dragon didn't say anything. He was just firmly stared at Yi Shiwen in order to see his reaction. Yi Shiwen frowned. He was silent and didn't say anything. He wasn't worried about his own safety. He had apparently heard some secrets. However, it shouldn't matter much. These things seemed secretive at first, but such matters didn't have any secrets to them in reality. He didn't know anything apart from the name of this organization, Northern Dipper. Not to mention that this was the hidden star peak of the true martial university. So these two men had better not provoke any old monster in this vicinity. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be able to run away from here. Yi Shiwen raised his head after he had considered the pros and cons. Then he smiled and spoke, "I'll join if that's the scene." There were indeed many benefits in joining this organization. And Yi Shiwen didn't see any harm either for the time being. He would anyway leave this organization if things didn't go well. Good, I'm glad. Wood Dragon laughed and said. Yi Shiwen got to know a bit about the situation within the Northern Dipper organization once he had agreed to join it. This was an organization that specialized in recruiting only top elites of the younger generation. It didn't have many full-time members if the bottom-level members weren't taken into account. There were only 14 real members apart from the organization's lord. The lord was titled Big Dipper. The 7 constellations of the Azure Dragon of the East constituted 7 seats, and the remaining 7 seats belonged to the 7 constellations of the Vermilion Bird of the South. These were their 14 members, and they still had vacancies. There weren't even 20 members in this organization at the moment. Yi Shiwen joined, and became the Golden Dragon of the Neck, which was one of the 7 constellations of the Azure Dragon of the East. This position had been kept for Emperor Chun in the beginning. However, it had now fallen into Yi Shiwen's hands. Qing Su was Moon Deer of the Extended Net. That was one of the 7 constellations of Vermilion Bird of the South. And that tall man who was Yi Shiwen's possible future partner was Wood Dragon of the Horn. This title was also named after one of the 7 constellations of the Azure Dragon of the East. Same as Yi Shiwen's title. I will inform you if there will be any task or matter in the future. You can choose to do the task or not. They gave Yi Shiwen a dragon ring and a set of white uniforms once they were done talking. And then they floated away and departed. Yi Shiwen was a bit dumbfounded as he saw them float away like a feather. They had said that this organization wasn't strict. However, that didn't mean that it was extremely liberal either. However, Yi Shiwen merely smiled. After all, the organization wouldn't put any restriction on his freedom. He could go anywhere he would like to whenever he wouldn't be on an assignment. And it would depend on him whether he wanted to undertake a task or not. Moreover, there would be no problem even if he didn't complete a single task throughout his career in this organization. However, he would obviously have to complete the tasks if he needed additional benefits. Everything depended on his contribution. He wouldn't be able to enjoy bonuses without contributing any points. He understood this well. After all, an organization needed lots of resources to grow and get stronger. Only then could it give benefits to its members. This was a common thing required for the growth of an organization or a sect. The leadership of this organization would end up getting their heads clamped by the gate if the organization only gave rewards to Yi Shiwen without seeking any returns. In fact, it would have appeared like a huge conspiracy if that had been the case. And Yi Shiwen wouldn't have joined it in that case. Where in the entire world can a person get free meals? One needs to pay something in order to get something. This is the truth of this world. Yi Shiwen shook his head and laughed as he thought this. He turned towards the hidden star peak, and drew a long shadow under the moonlight as he trod forward. Yi Shiwen, Qi Fifan, and the whole group celebrated Yi Shiwen's win that night. And he left for the Metropolis Martial Peak without disturbing anybody the next morning. The Metropolis Martial Peak had become the True Martial University's core place. However, the True Martial Secret Territory's contribution couldn't be ignored either. In fact, everyone knew that it was the most dreadful place in the entire True Martial University. Brother Yi. Zheng Hushu's voice sounded not from afar. He wore a smile on his face as he came over treading the void. Hello, senior brother Zheng. Yi Shiwen cupped his hands in obeisance and said. Zheng Hushu didn't exchange any further greetings with Yi Shiwen, and directly came to the point. Come with me, let's go to the True Martial Secret Territory. Yi Shiwen followed Zheng Hushu to the depths of the Metropolis Martial Peak, and arrived at an open and desolate area. They had merely landed when an old man arrived limping. Zheng Hushu promptly stepped forward, and saluted the old man. He said, Hello, senior. The Supreme Lord has asked me to bring Yi Shiwen to the True Martial Secret Territory. The skinny old man looked at Yi Shiwen. He let out a smile and said, You're Yi Shiwen? Good, very good. It seemed as if he was impressed with Yi Shiwen. I'm flattered, senior. Yi Shiwen promptly saluted and replied. The way this old man was limping made it seem as if he would be blown away by the wind the next moment. However, Yi Shiwen didn't dare to underestimate him. He was the guard of the True Martial Secret Territory. How could he be an ordinary person? I must say that there aren't many people in the younger generation who are as talented as you. The old man's eyes flashed. It seemed as if he had seen through Yi Shiwen's secrets. He had seen through Yi Shiwen's suave aura in just a glance, and had also noticed the fact that he had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. Consequently, a trace of amazement had flashed in his eyes. The old man didn't say much. He quickly unwound a seal with his finger. Then an incredibly large force ripped the void open, and a portal appeared. Rumble. The void had been ripped apart into two halves along with the sound of the explosion, and another world had been exposed. Rivers and interconnected mountains were spread everywhere. There were fresh clouds and gentle winds all around. In fact, it almost looked like a microcosm. Both of them went straight into the True Martial Secret Territory. Yi Shiwen looked as far as he could. However, it seemed unending. The size of the True Martial Secret Territory was simply beyond his imagination. Rich spirit energy blew against his face. It was so strong that he could even see them with naked eyes. It was several times stronger than the spirit energy in the outside world. The underground spirit arteries were boiling. Yi Shiwen even suspected that these might be dragon's arteries. Yi Shiwen was seeing dragon's arteries for the third time in his life. The first one he had seen had already dried up. Only a few chunks of dragon essence were left in them at the time. He had come across a dragon's arteries for the second time on the planet of the Wind Dragon, but they had been locked up under the ground by some ancient almighty. However, he wasn't sure whether the spiritual arteries located here were dragon's arteries or not. He had merely made a guess. But he didn't have any proof. And he obviously couldn't confirm it even if he was right. It was a divine item. Therefore, countless experts must be keeping watch over it since it ensured the true martial university's prosperity. The biggest difference between dragon's arteries and spiritual arteries was that the former could bring luck and prosperity, and could assist a sect or force in its growth and development. It was quite difficult for a sect's luck energy stock to exhaust if the dragon's veins weren't depleted. Both of them went inside the true martial secret territory. They passed through many different regions. They also saw many powerhouses who had tyrannical strengths and extremely powerful auras. They were submerged deep in their cultivation. Suddenly, an extremely tyrannical divine sense swept over both of them. Then it shrank back. These experts are the genuine elites of our true martial university. Many of them had become famous 1,000 years ago. And there are also those who had become famous several thousand years ago. Zheng Heshu gave an introduction. These people had once made great contributions to the true martial university, so they've been allowed to stay here forever in return. Zheng Heshu explained further. A somewhat desirous look had appeared on his face. To get an opportunity to cultivate here for a year was considered a great fortune. What could only possibly speak of an opportunity to stay here forever? Yishuan nodded. He had done some research last night. However, the true understanding of the true martial secret territory couldn't be obtained in one day of research. Even many of the sage experts weren't allowed to stay here for a year, let alone staying here forever. He didn't know what kind of contribution these people had made towards the true martial university, that they had received such privilege in return. He couldn't help but became speechless in the secrecy of his heart. Watermoon Fairyland was located in the core place of the true martial secret territory. Zheng Heshu's growth rate wasn't quick, so he really wanted to cultivate here. But Yi Xuan was the one who had arrived to cultivate here at this time, and he had merely guided him till here. He couldn't cultivate here in secrecy. However, it would be great if he could stay here for some more time. Yi Xuan didn't mind that either. So he also continued to observe the true martial secret territory along the way. Both of them soon entered an endless desert. It was stretched as far as one could see. There were sandstorms billowing everywhere. In fact, the range of these sandstorms seemed nearly endless. Most importantly, Yishuan almost didn't feel a bit of spirit energy here. He had been able to feel the world principles very clearly before. However, they were very faintly visible here. In fact, they were almost hard to feel. Chapter 469. He's really a freak. It seemed as if this place had experienced the doomsday. The spirit energy of this place had been seemingly used up. The principles were disrupted. Yi Shiwen felt as if he had returned to his previous life on the earth. The era of the end of principles. What kind of a place is this? How there can be such a place in the true martial secret territory? Yi Shiwen asked. This place had toppled his impression regarding the true martial secret territory. He had previously thought that a place like the true martial secret territory would be filled with heavenly treasures and spirit energy. In fact, he had almost guessed every situation he had seen so far after he had entered this territory. So, he hadn't thought that there would be such a desolate place inside. The sandstorm was rising in the distance. The northern wind was whistling in the endless sand. A figure slowly came out of it in small steps. Not a bit of real elemental energy was fluctuating on his body. Not even the principles were fluctuating on him. He looked like an ordinary person who was facing difficulty in walking through the sandstorm. And it seemed as if he was carrying heavy weight on his body since his feet were getting stuck in the sand with every step he took. It was hard to tell how long it took him, but he arrived near these two men. However, it seemed as if he hadn't seen them since he simply walked past them. He wasn't distracted one bit by their presence. It seemed as if nothing in this world could distract him from his purpose. He went away from them in his usual small-stepped style of walk. However, Yishuan clearly noticed that he possessed a terrifying aura. Zheng Heshu opened his mouth and spoke only when that man had gone far away. These people are the hardship cultivators. This world is opened up especially for them. These people might be the strongest of our true martial university. However, they are also a group of lunatics. A scared look had appeared on Zheng Hushu's face when he had spoken the word lunatics. Hardship cultivators Yi Shiwen had seen the records on these people in some ancient books. These were a group of people who bore hardships happily. They would try to use all kinds of methods to torture their body and spirit. And they would gain enlightenment by enduring endless pain. They would sublimate within pain and suffering to learn about the world principles through experience. Zheng Hushu was right when he had addressed them as a group of lunatics. They were a genuine group of madmen. They weren't like the other ruthless experts. The ruthless experts would force their enemies to such an extreme situation from where they might not be able to come out. And even a naive person might transform into an incredibly tyrannical person in the usual style of cultivation. However, these hardship cultivators weren't like that. They were ruthless towards their enemies, but they were even more ruthless upon themselves. They would use all kinds of cruel methods to deal with their enemies, but would use even worse ones upon themselves. So their minds and bodies were very dreadful. These hardship cultivators were considered the most formidable group of people inside any sect, because they weren't afraid of death. They looked like a group of madmen in a real fight, because didn't care about their own lives. Moreover, these hardship cultivators rarely went out of their way to provoke others for a fight. However, it would be a dead end for others if they dared to provoke them. Yi Shiwen hadn't seen anything on the body of that person. However, he had guessed that this man had probably added a matrix formation on his own body to increase the gravitational force upon himself. This was quite common because these hardship cultivators didn't practice any sort of body power techniques. They would purely rely on such oppressive methods for strengthening their bodies. They believed that human body was God's masterpiece in itself. So it was the most perfect thing in the entire world in their eyes. Therefore, practicing those body power techniques would transform one's constitution, and would make the human body profane as a result. Only the natural methods were the best in their opinions. This was a simple method. However, it was very difficult to stick to it for a long time. There had been many hardship cultivators among the powerful entities of previous generations. These people weren't born that easily, but they had made the entire world tremble whenever they had taken birth. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but secretly swallow his saliva as he saw the figure of that man disappear into the distance. These people genuinely deserved to be called madmen. Cultivating in an environment which was devoid of spirit energy and principles was a very big test of people. A person must laboriously temper their body. And it was even harder in this kind of a situation where one couldn't feel the principles, or utilize their real elemental energy. One must save even a thread of one's real elemental energy to use in such an environment where there wasn't a bit of spirit energy. One might not be able to make a single breakthrough even after one had practiced for 10 years or 100 years in such harsh conditions. However, one would advance by leaps and bounds once they had made the breakthrough. This type of a cultivation method was indeed very harsh. Only a person who possessed great willpower could cultivate under such situation. Otherwise, it was impossible. Yi Shiwen admired this harsh cultivation method, but wouldn't use it himself. Both of them left for the centermost place of the true martial secret territory, after they had passed through this desolate region. Even a sage expert like Zheng Hushu had become extremely cautious in this region. The tyrannical divine senses would often sweep past them. However, these probing divine senses eventually disappeared once they had entered the Water-Moon Fairyland. Yi Shiwen found that a barrier had been laid out around the Water-Moon Fairyland, and this barrier had cut off those people's divine senses. Zheng Hushu pointed towards the surroundings once they reached inside, and spoke. This is the Water-Moon Fairyland. The Water-Moon Cave isn't accessible to the outside world in any other way. This is the only path. There are 49 heritages inside the Water-Moon Fairyland, and you can choose any one of them for your comprehension. Even these heritages aren't open to the outside world. However, you're likely to reach the peak of the Great Sage Realm if you comprehend even one amongst them. Zheng Hushu looked at Yi Shiwen with an envious look in his eyes. Each of these 49 heritages was outstanding. One would become extremely powerful if the said individual managed to cultivate even one of them to the depth. However, Not everyone could obtain such an opportunity. Even the Heaven's Pride experts must wait for a long time until they had entered the sage realm. Only then might they get enrolled for cultivating in this place. He knew that Yi Shiwen was the only semi-sage expert who had been allowed to come here. Yi Shiwen looked as far as his eyes could see, but he only saw endless plains. 49 stone pillars stood erect on the plain. Each of these pillars was over 10,000 feet tall. There were some inexplicable symbols engraved on each of these pillars. These were possibly ancient seal characters. It was impossible for anyone to understand which race these scripts belonged to. However, one didn't need to read it in order to understand, one only needed to comprehend. That's because the people who had left these writings behind had also engraved their own insights into these stone pillars. And that meant that one would only need to comprehend those insights. Otherwise, no one would have been able to understand anything if they had only left these writings behind. Several people were sitting upright in front of these 49 stone pillars. Each of them was guarding a pillar, and was deep in comprehension as well. Many of them looked very old, and had long thick beards. They were sitting upright, and motionless. In fact, they almost seemed as if they were dead. These seemingly dead figures unexpectedly swept out their divine senses. One among them looked approximately 20 years old. However, his divine sense appeared like an exceptionally sharp sword. It looked like a long sword in the sky as it swept over. A dreadful aura swept into Yi Shiwen's body. He didn't wait for Yi Shiwen to counterattack, and immediately pulled the divine sense back into his body. It happened so fast that Yi Shiwen couldn't even see it. Yi Shiwen was fortunate that the heavenly source mirror was protecting his body. Therefore, the imposing aura of that divine sense had hardly caused any effect on him. Not to mention that he presently wasn't the kind of a person whom anybody could have their own way with. On the contrary, Zheng Hushu had begun to have heartache because of the sudden attack of that imposing aura. "Are you okay?" Yi Shiwen asked. "I'm all right." Zheng Hushu shook his head, smiled and replied. His complexion had turned somewhat pale. He had obviously replied with a lie. The truth was hidden in his heart. This true martial secret territory was very strange. A sage expert like him had sustained serious injuries by a person's mere divine sense. Yi Shiwen was obviously even more freakish. A sage expert who stood beside him had sustained injuries. However, he was fine. Moreover, his calm face made it obvious that he hadn't faced any difficulty. It seemed as if he simply hadn't been affected by it. He was truly a freak. However, it was understandable. He wouldn't have been allowed to come here while being in the semi-sage realm if he weren't a freak. Suddenly, several divine senses swept over with a whoosh sound. They read Yi Shiwen's strength, and became somewhat amazed. They recalled their divine senses within a split second. Their time was very precious. So they couldn't waste it on such a trivial matter. They had only done this to verify that there was no danger. "Can I choose only one of these heritages?" Yi Shiwen asked. "That's right. You can choose only one," Zheng Hushu replied. "In fact, this rule is for your own good. Each of these heritages is supreme. You won't be able to learn anything if you try to study all of them at once." Yi Shiwen understood this point. However, he didn't feel that he couldn't study all of them. He had the help of mysterious space. So, the very question of not being able to study them all was outside the range of his consideration. But the mysterious space required spirit energy in order to function. And one shouldn't look at his stock of over 20 million primary spirit dawn as a lot. They seemed to be much at first, but all of it would be gone if he tried to study all of these heritages at once. So it would be pointless. When it came to learning heritages, it by no means meant that the more secret techniques one knew the better it would get. First, one must take into account which technique would suit well. Secondly, one must see the possibility of being able to cultivate the secret technique to the greater extent. The more profound the cultivation gets, the better it would be for the said individual. He had already started to study his own heritages such as ancient arts and secret techniques. Therefore, the most important thing for him wasn't to learn more and more secret techniques, since he had already learnt many secret techniques. Instead, he must fuse these secret techniques together and turn them into one system. He had learned many secret techniques such as the Phoenix Regeneration Technique, Tyrant Body Technique, coiling dragon palm, overturning the heaven's seal, and so on. Each of them possessed wonderful effects and power. However, these techniques had come from different forces, and even from different races. They were scattered. So Yi Shiwen's priority was to fuse these secret techniques and form one system. He might turn over a new leaf and form his very own secret technique sooner or later. This was very similar to making the breakthrough into the sage realm from one aspect. He would need to join the scattered and disorderly principles during the breakthrough, and would have to bring them into a situation where they would be separate but non-chaotic. Yi Shiwen had learned many secret techniques by now, and many of them had different systems. So they weren't compatible, and couldn't operate together without causing inconvenience. There were still obstructions. Therefore, studying all these heritages wasn't something he would choose to do. The fewer the better was certainly his choice considering the amount of primary spirit dawn he had in his pocket. Yi Shiwen proceeded to choose a heritage once he had made up his mind. Chapter 470 comprehends the secret cultivation. There were a myriad of inheritances. There were martial art techniques, internal power techniques, and so on. Peacock Dragon Hand, Heavenly Crane Flash, 3-star Strength, the Fist of Primal Chaos, Yearning God Step. Yi Shiwen's gaze fell on these startling heritages, one by one. Huge stone pillars were erected steeply from the ground in succession, and they were towering from the ground. Each of them had a unique and imposing presence. Each of these pillars was extremely terrifying, and contained the world's essence. These world's essences could easily suppress a powerful sage expert to death. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but frown as he saw them. These heritages might not have been left behind by the ancestors of the true martial university, because he could feel that these heritages were extremely extraordinary. No wonder it was said that one might become invincible in the true martial world if the said individual was able to comprehend any one of these. Yi Shiwen continued to look at these heritages as he walked past them. However, he didn't find any of them to be worthy of comprehension. Then he suddenly stopped in front of a monument. He felt as if his observing person scripture was getting virtually spurred within his body as soon as he stood in front of this stele. In fact, the small solar system within his body had involuntarily begun to revolve along a mysterious orbit. It was going to somewhere dark and mysterious, like the real universe itself. Yi Shiwen was taken aback. He raised his head to see. He was surprised to see chaos above the stele. There was a drawing of an everlasting pattern of stars within the chaos. Moreover, there was a rotating nebula and a rotating universe. It looked different every time he saw it. Sometimes, it looked like a complete universe. Sometimes he could only see a star. He felt as if his mind was being torn apart by merely watching such quick transformations taking place. Pant, pant, pant. Yi Shiwen was panting heavily. He had seen it for a moment only, and it seemed as if his mind had processed countless years. The entire back of his body had turned wet. What's the name of this stele? I choose this. He had walked down, and had seen more than 10 heritages by now. However, none of them had been able to resonate with his observing person scripture. However, this stele had managed it. So he was convinced with his decision. This is called Big Bang Stardust Fist. Zheng Hushu thought for a second before he explained. This is an unusual fist technique. It is said that one can grab the stars and seize the moon if this technique is practiced to the peak. One can even explode a star in one punch. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but become speechless in the secrecy of his heart. One could explode a star in one punch? Such strength was impossible to possess before the great sage realm. It was far too powerful. However, this fist technique is quite odd. Next to nobody has been able to comprehend it. History says that only the founder of your hidden star peak has comprehended it so far. Zheng Hushu added. Only the founder of the hidden star peak had comprehended it once. There was no mystery to this fact. He had clearly seen his observing person scripture being activated in a mysterious manner. So, there had to be some relation between it and something inside this heritage. Yi Shiwen thought for a while, and he suddenly realized that the feeling he just experienced was quite similar to the one he had gotten at the time he had comprehended the hidden star scripture. on the hidden star peak. Moreover, the hidden star scripture was also engraved on a stone wall. Could it be that these were a set of matching techniques? After all, his observing person scripture was inspired by the hidden star scripture. So shouldn't there be some kind of relation on ideal terms? Countless years had flashed through Yi Shiwen's mind in this moment. However, he smiled the very next moment, and replied, I understand. I would like to choose this heritage. This one. Zheng Hushu felt somewhat awkward as he looked at Yi Shiwen. Next to nobody has ever been able to comprehend this heritage. But it's your choice at the end of the day. You don't need to force yourself if you can't do it. You can always switch to next the steel whenever you want. Okay. Yi Shiwen nodded. He wasn't stupid either. He obviously wouldn't force himself if he couldn't comprehend it. Okay. So I will take my leave now. I will wait to hear the good news from young brother. Zheng Hushu was somewhat reluctant to leave. He kept looking at this water-moon fairyland. However, he had no choice but to leave in the end. Yi Shiwen sat cross-legged in front of this Big Bang Stardust fist. Once Zheng Hushu had departed, he raised his head and looked intently at that heritage. Big Bang Stardust fist was engraved on the front side of the steel. These steels and martial arts secret books were different. Martial arts secret books would explain how to practice a technique in a straightforward manner. Every variation was clearly mentioned and explained to make a person understand. So one only needed to follow the steps. However, these incredible heritages often required to be comprehended on one's own. They were similar to the coiling dragon palm, which must be comprehended by oneself. Only the essence, energy, and spirit were left behind to guide the practitioner in the right direction. It would have been impossible for Yi Shiwen to comprehend the coiling dragon palm, as per his then strength and level, if he didn't possess the mysterious space. In fact, it would have been impossible for him to break down the coiling dragon palm and comprehend it to the pinnacle if he didn't possess the mysterious space. Thus, he would have had to struggle to comprehend it layer by layer through constant practice. There were obviously some techniques he had learnt which had been described in books as well. For example, Phoenix Regeneration Technique was described in a book. In fact, its level was still comparatively higher at that time because the martial arts techniques would become very mysterious after a certain level. Then one would be able to comprehend them depending on their own experience and level. And those who couldn't comprehend would never be able to comprehend, even if one would describe it to them personally with their own mouth. How many secret techniques could one comprehend by depending on their perception and level as per their experience? The same was true for the coiling dragon palm and Big Bang Stardust fist. However, the Phoenix Regeneration Technique was explained in such an easy language that everyone could understand its esoteric concepts by merely reading it. It was obviously different than the coiling dragon palm. So it had to be comprehended personally, and the extent of its comprehension depended on one's own capability. It didn't matter whether the founder of these secret techniques and heritages had placed them in terms of relative superiority. Yi Shiwen wouldn't become disheartened even if the Big Bang Stardust fist was the most inferior one among them. This Big Bang Stardust fist would appear like a star atlas to outsiders. It looked so simple. However, it looked completely different to Yi Shiwen. It appeared like massive array of revolving stars to his eyes. He felt as if he could almost see through the entire universe by looking at this star atlas. And this was a profound feeling that had gripped his heart. In fact, he had almost lost himself in that carefree feeling. This star atlas had revealed the mysteries of the stars. Yi Shiwen could nearly feel the secrets of the stars. It was a mysterious, yet profound feeling. However, he couldn't see it clearly. That's why this feeling had made him very depressed. Countless primary spirit dawn had begun to burn inside the heavenly source mirror. The released spirit energy seemingly formed a long liver and flowed into the mysterious space. The mysterious space had been silent until now. However, it began to operate crazily once an endless influx of spirit energies poured into it. And those mysterious and profound insights he couldn't understand in the beginning had been absorbed by the mysterious space. It then began to analyze them in a frantic manner. Yi Shiwen had comprehended countless esoteric insights in this split second, even though he couldn't understand them earlier. Those groups of characters which had earlier appeared like nonsense had transformed into simplified language. In fact, they could be easily comprehended by merely looking at them now. This mass of information was engraved in Yi Shiwen's mind. This gave him an extremely satisfied feeling. In fact, this feeling of sudden and bright comprehension couldn't be compared or replaced with another. Moreover, only Yi Shiwen could have dared to do such a thing. An average person wouldn't dare to comprehend so much in such a continuous manner. Otherwise, the comprehension of their martial way might have gotten affected by it. After all, the martial technique created by someone would contain its own way. And this was even more so for a martial technique that needed to be comprehended instead of being followed. After all, such a martial technique contained the majority of the founder's own perception of the martial way. Therefore, a person would get immersed into a martial technique while comprehending it. This was very dangerous. One might get stuck inside it if immersed too deep, and might never be able to come out of its maze to revert back to one's own way. And this would obviously limit their future prospects. Therefore, the people who wanted to comprehend such martial techniques must possess strong willpower, and they must possess formidable mental strength. Otherwise, they might become idiots by the impact. Even those so-called peerless geniuses wouldn't dare to immerse themselves into a martial technique like Yi Shiwen had, because they might never be able to come out of it. Only he could do this since he had help from his mysterious space. His innate aptitude may have differed by much from those peerless geniuses. However, his progress speed wasn't slow. Time passed day by day, and that star atlas didn't look like a sea of stars in Yi Shiwen's eyes as time passed. In fact, it had slowly begun to form galaxies. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen was sitting cross-legged at the center of a universe while he was sitting in front of the stele. The universe was empty, and there wasn't a single object in it at first. In fact, there was deathly stillness throughout. However, it had begun to become more and more profound as his comprehension became more and more deep. Stars had also begun to appear inside his body as time had passed. A giant star had appeared inside Yi Shiwen's body at first. Then it had exploded into infinite rays of light, which had then illuminated the entire universe. This was the only source of light in this universe. And he was the only living creature inside it. He was also the only god of this universe. This universe didn't exist in real. It only existed in his spiritual world. However, there was no difference between this universe and the real one. These stars and this universe were born from his idea, and they would extinguish with one thought his. Yi Shiwen genuinely felt like a god because of this feeling. The universe had been formed by this thought, and it could be extinguished by his thought. He was like the legendary Buddha who was mentioned in the fables, the only true god in the universe. It was as if he could see the world in a grain of sand. Many stars gradually began to appear as his comprehension became more and more deep. Stars began to appear, planets began to appear, satellites began to appear, cosmic dust began to appear, and meteorites began to appear. It looked more and more like a universe and more like the real universe. Yi Shiwen's progress was extremely fast. An average person couldn't match his speed even if they possessed a God-given wisdom and rare talent. However, he could achieve such speed. He had already comprehended this Big Bang Stardust Fist to an incredible extent with the assistance of the mysterious space. In addition, his observing person scripture had also formed a universe inside his body. So his speed obviously wouldn't be lessened since he possessed some prior experience. Chapter 471. Amazes with his progress. Time was passing day by day. Months passed in a flash, and 3 years came to disappear within the blink of an eye. Yi Shiwen was sitting upright in front of the stele of the Big Bang Stardust Fist. He hadn't moved from this spot in the last 1 year. Yi Shiwen's aura had turned calm and clear. Whatever bit of impatient aura he had in the beginning had become calm by now. He had reached the peak of the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. His cultivation hadn't made much progress in these 3 years. He had suppressed his cultivation since the beginning. He had only practiced the Big Bang Stardust Fist in these 3 years, and had managed to practice it to an extremely profound level. It could be said that he had given the majority of his time to this Big Bang Stardust Fist in these years. Yi Shiwen had gone to that desolate region, the one which looked like the era of the end of the principles several times in the span of 3 years. He had given up the advantages of being an expert, just like those hardship cultivators. Plus, he had also added a matrix formation on his body to increase the gravitational force upon himself. And he had unceasingly tempered his body and spirit to the peak. However, he hadn't moved for the past 1 year. His body looked like a statue. A terrifying aura suddenly emerged out of his body. It formed a pillar of energy and soared into the sky. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen's surroundings had transformed into a universe that was an endless void. Yi Shiwen was sitting cross-legged in the center of this universe. He appeared like an ancient god. Countless principles were boiling in the surroundings. They could be seen clearly with the naked eyes. He had forced these principles to come out. These principles had initially been hidden in the void. However, they could be seen with the naked eyes now. Yi Shiwen's understanding of the principles and the main Tao had advanced by leaps and bounds after he had gone to that desolate region, which was devoid of principles. This obvious progress could be felt almost anywhere and anytime. Yi Shiwen returned to the Water Moon Fairyland after he had practiced in that region for a certain period of time. And he had realized that his understanding of the principles had progressed at a flying speed after he returned to the Water Moon Fairyland. Moreover, his sensitivity towards the principles had also reached an astonishing degree after he had spent some time in that region that was devoid of principles. Yi Shiwen was convinced that these hardship cultivators would make astonishing breakthroughs within a short period of time if they came outside that region. In fact, he believed that they wouldn't face any difficulty in doing so. For example, one could skyrocket to the peak of the Great Sage Realm from the initial stage of the Sage Realm after cultivating in that desolate region for several hundred or over 1,000 years. But how many people could endure so much suffering for hundreds of years, or over 1,000 years? And nobody would complain if one could achieve it somehow, and if their cultivation increased by leaps and bounds thereafter. After all, one must pay something in order to obtain something. This is the unalterable law of the world. Therefore, Yi Shiwen had gone to that region several times to undergo bitter cultivation. He would then return to the Water Moon Fairyland to continue his practice. Yi Shiwen would soon have to leave this Water Moon Fairyland since the 3 years were about to come to an end. The other people were still sitting upright in front of the steels. They were as motionless as statues. And he had no doubt that they would continue to sit motionless for their entire lifetimes if required. Yi Shiwen's aura suddenly alarmed many disciples who were undergoing closed-door training. Extremely tyrannical divine senses swept over to check him out. In fact, the most inferior among them was that of a peak expert of the Sage Realm. However, Yi Shiwen had no time to attend to other people at this time. He was immersed inside his small universe. Other people didn't exist inside his dimension. Only he and his universe were present there. He had constructed this universe in 3 years. He was the only god of this universe. And his words were enough to make all living things extinguish inside it. The observing person scripture was frantically operating within his body. The solar system had also begun to revolve around him. He was at the center of the universe. He was the god. He was the enlightened one. His aura was rising little by little. He was about to make a breakthrough to the middle stage of the semi-sage realm. However, his fighting strength would then make the breakthrough to the sage realm. So this was a very crucial test for him. It was an impossible thing for other people because the biggest difference between the sage realm and the semi-sage realm was that the principles in the sage realm were scattered but not chaotic. They were condensed together in an ordered fashion, as if all the principles were strung together. Therefore, there would obviously see a qualitative change in the sage realm. This required an entirely new level of understanding of the principles. An average person in the initial stage of the semi-sage realm would have merely begun to touch the principles. However, only Yi Shiwen had been able to achieve such level. His understanding of the principles had always remained ahead of his peers since the beginning thanks to his mysterious space. And he was finally ready to begin to make the breakthrough into the middle stage of the semi-sage realm after 3 years of preparations. He must also unite all his principles and establish a connection between them. And his strength would witness an astonishing change after he had succeeded in doing that. Yi Shiwen's 1,000 Tao principles began to boil. And they began to revolve around him. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen was going on a rampage. And these 1,000 Tao principles had also accompanied him in doing so. Yet these principles formed a piece of the universe. The observing person scripture was operating frantically. It was operating within Yi Shiwen's body and was stirring up real elemental energy throughout his body. He was gradually making a breakthrough as a result. Then, Yi Shiwen suddenly stood up and began to throw his fists in succession. They looked simple at first. However, they carried terrifying might. He shot one fist, and the void in front of him shattered into pieces. It wasn't some gorgeous move. It was merely an ordinary fist. Everything before his eyes gradually vanished as he continued to shoot his fists one after another. He was only thinking about the Big Bang Stardust Fist in his heart. Hey, hasn't he practiced the Big Bang Stardust Fist? The voice of an old senior sounded at this time. He seemed to be puzzled. It seemed as if he hadn't opened his mouth for the last thousands of years. So his voice sounded somewhat rusty at this time. Yeah, it's the Big Bang Stardust Fist. Who is this man? Isn't he a disciple of the Hidden Star Peak? Otherwise, how could he have practiced Big Bang Stardust Fist? This technique carries infinite might. However, most people are unable to practice it. Indeed, who is this young man? He's not even 50 years of age, yet he possesses such strength. Is he this term's Heaven's Pride expert? He is a semi-sage expert, yet he has qualified to enter this place. This young man isn't ordinary. Many divine senses met in the air and chatted among themselves. These people hadn't spoken since last several years. An ordinary person simply couldn't catch their attention. However, Yi Shiwen's 1,000 Tao principles had impressed them. 999 Tao principles was the limit of the semi-sage realm. But this young man had surpassed this limit. So he obviously wasn't an ordinary person. No wonder he had chosen to practice the Big Bang Stardust Fist. He wasn't like ordinary people. So he obviously wouldn't walk on an ordinary road. Yi Shiwen's 1,000 Tao principles leapt up in the air. It seemed as if the world had suddenly lost its color. The world was changing its form violently. This scene attracted the attention of many old fogies who had been undergoing closed-door training since countless years. Yi Shiwen hadn't anticipated this reaction. But he had no time to pay attention to these things right now. He had made the breakthrough into the middle stage of the semi-sage realm without crossing the heavenly tribulation. However, he couldn't afford to relax. Each of these principles had been condensed by him in person. But each of them was unruly and untamed. So it wasn't easy to establish a connection between them. One mistake, and his hard work would be wasted. His plan of raising his fighting strength to the sage realm would obviously be ruined if he failed in this step. In fact, he had suppressed his martial power for last 3 years, because his aim was to promote his fighting strength to the sage realm. His aim for the past 3 years had been to bind these 1,000 Tao principles together. He couldn't afford to fail now. He would have to wait until the breakthrough to the late stage of the semi-sage realm for the next probable opportunity if he didn't succeed at this time. Rumble. Yi Shiwen shot his fist. The unleashed energy twisted on the spot to form a huge star. It fell down in the sky and smashed open a huge hole in the void. One must know about the present situation here. The space of the true martial secret territory was reinforced, just like it was in the metropolis martial peak. Perhaps, it was a bit more strengthened here than it was at the metropolis martial peak. And Yi Shiwen had broken the space under such circumstances. One could clearly see how much power Yi Shiwen's Big Bang Stardust Fist carried even though he had brandished it in a very casual manner. One could grab the stars and seize the moon if they practiced this technique to the peak. Destroying the heaven and exterminating the earth would be a joke. The divine senses of many old fogies swept back after they had read Yi Shiwen's status. They all looked somewhat gratified. These people were the senior experts of the true martial university. So they would obviously feel exceptionally happy to see someone so incredible in the younger generation of their university. Rumble. 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 Yi Shiwen became more and more familiar with Big Bang Stardust Fist, with every move he shot. He was a bit unfamiliar with this technique in the beginning. However, he became more and more familiar with it as time passed. He had thoroughly understood this technique in his mind by now, so he was able to display it freely. Yi Shiwen had comprehended the Big Bang Stardust Fist since last 3 years. However, he had spent the majority of time in understanding the fist intention of the Big Bang Stardust Fist. But he hadn't gained any practical experience yet. Therefore, Yi Shiwen's understanding of the Big Bang Stardust Fist skyrocketed as soon as he began to use it. It could be said that he was quite unfamiliar with this technique. However, he was merely unfamiliar with it, nothing more. He had already learned the style of the Big Bang Stardust Fist. So he gained the rhythm of punches rather quickly, and he started to become more and more accurate. He soon became familiar with this technique to such an extent that it seemed as if he had been practicing it for several decades, just like an old fogey who had practiced it throughout his life. He was initially following the styles in sequence, from the beginning to the end. However, he surpassed these styles' limitations very quickly. He then randomly combined these styles together, and this step had stunned countless people. An ordinary person wouldn't be able to do it even after he had practiced for several decades. Even an exceptional genius would require several years' time for doing this. However, Yi Shiwen had progressed so rapidly before their eyes. In fact, he was still progressing with each move he used. His initially rigid style gradually became freer. He was no longer clinging to the established moves, gestures, and styles. Suddenly, something happened that made them even more surprised. Yi Shiwen abandoned the martial style altogether. He shot his fist and launched a kick, but he didn't use any martial method. However, his attack still possessed formidable power. Chapter 472 enters the intermediate stage of semi-sage realm. Yi Shiwen had made astonishing progress before everyone's eyes. Moreover, he had abandoned the moves he had learned, but his one fist had still unleashed great power. It could genuinely scare a group of people to death because it wasn't some primary power technique or intermediate power technique, etc. Rather, it was a stunning heritage. The moves of such top-tier martial arts often contain the power of Tao within. That's why each of the moves unleashed great might. These people could easily practice low-level trash martial arts to the extreme and assume formlessness within a minute. However, many among them had been practicing this heritage for centuries and still hadn't reached such an extent. However, they saw that Yi Shiwen had reached such an extent. His moves hadn't been smooth at first. However, his present moves were terrifying enough to scare a person to death. Yi Shiwen obviously didn't know what these people were thinking. Otherwise, he would have become very depressed. His progress was extremely quick in other people's opinion. However, he had wasted a lot of mental and physical effort in these 3 years. And nobody had seen that happen. He had to sit motionless for several months during these 3 years in order to comprehend the fist intention of the Big Bang Stardust Fist. And the other moves were easy pickings for him once he had grasped the fist intention. So, assuming formlessness was only a matter of time. He merely had to polish it a little bit, and he could achieve that stage rather easily thereafter. It was like he could solve any mathematical problem within a moment if he had mastered all mathematical formulae. The nature of the mathematical problem wouldn't make much difference to him. He had also consumed most of the 20 million primary spirit dawn in order to comprehend the Tao theories of this technique. And he only had about 1 million primary spirit dawn left in his stock. It was still an astronomical wealth for a semi-sage expert. However, it was far from enough for him. Moreover, it was important to note that he had consumed almost 20 million primary spirit dawn in just 3 years. However, it was the payback time now. He had comprehended the Big Bang Stardust Fist to such an extent in such a short time. One could say that it had happened because of the consumption of these 20 million primary spirit dawn. And also because he had practiced like the hardship cultivators in the last 3 years. Rumble. 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 Yi Shiwen shot the Big Bang Stardust Fist, one after another. The divine senses which had swept over to him had soon lost interest. It had gotten noisy and lively here. So, they had come to check it out for themselves. However, they had seen it now. So they suddenly lost interest. and they withdrew their divine senses in quick succession. Yi Shiwen was the only one left on the spot. He unceasingly shot the Big Bang Stardust Fist, and his moves were gradually becoming more and more profound. Bang! The duration for which Yi Shiwen continued to throw punches in such a chaotic manner was unknown. He shot his fist, and the power of his fist shattered the void. This made the chaos to pour out in torrents. And then, it disappeared rather quickly without a trace. It seemed as if this punch had broken all the barriers of Yi Shiwen. He had established a connection with his inner realm, and his aura suddenly surged into the sky. Yi Shiwen suddenly opened his eyes. An incomparably strong power was boiling in his body. He had finally established the connection that'd lead him to the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. He had prepared for 3 years for this moment alone. He had put great effort over these past 3 years just for this moment. And he was finally going to reap the harvest now. He had finally started to make the breakthrough into the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen's principles were getting bound together by an invisible string as he made the breakthrough. Suddenly, his soul added the finishing touch to this entire binding process, and brought it to an end. And his aura instantaneously became extremely powerful. He suddenly felt that one punch of his would have been enough to defeat his enemies of the previous fights. This was the so-called disparity in strength. The promotion of Yi Shiwen's aura didn't stop. On the contrary, it had just begun. And that was because his principles had begun to condense crazily on top of the foundation of 1,000 Tao principles. His principles were condensing much quicker at this time of making the breakthrough than on usual times. He had been stuck at the initial stage of the semi-sage realm, and thus, he had no way to condense more principles. However, he had already made the breakthrough into the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm now. So his strength had become far more tyrannical. His body strength had also reached a higher level. Therefore it could hold more principles now. 1001 Tao principles. 1002 Tao principles. 1099 Tao principles. 1100 Tao principles. Yi Shiwen had made a successful breakthrough into the intermediate stage of semi-sage realm. Moreover, his fighting strength had also made a breakthrough to the initial stage of the sage realm. He possessed 1100 Tao principles now, and each of his Tao principles was exceptionally thick. In fact, he believed that he would be able to defeat the experts of the initial stage of the sage realm with the help of his present strength. His accumulation was genuinely very deep. His fighting strength had reached the peak of the semi-sage realm 3 years ago. However, he hadn't made a breakthrough in these 3 years, and had continued to accumulate instead. So his accumulation must have reached an astonishing level. It was going to be world-shaking regardless of whether he'd make a breakthrough or not. Yi Shiwen's principles became condensed after a long time passed. His aura had also slowly calmed down. He had fully entered the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. He silently looked at this place. He had stayed here for 3 years. Then he immediately returned to the true martial secret territory without looking back. It was a good place indeed. Yi Shiwen had guessed that his fighting strength would reach the sage level in 5 years. However, it had happened in 3 years only. One must say that he had obtained great benefits inside this true martial secret territory. It had taken nearly half the time he had expected it to take. There was obviously another reason behind this. He didn't have so many primary spirit dawn when he had calculated the time it would take for his fighting strength to reach the sage level. In fact, he had gotten the confidence of making the breakthrough because he possessed so many primary spirit dawn at this time. 3 years had ended, and Yi Shiwen had no reason to stay here any further. So he left for the true martial secret territory's exit. That old man was still limping at the gate of the true martial secret territory. It seemed as if he would breathe his last breath any second now. He still looked the same as he did 3 years ago. However, Yi Shiwen didn't dare to look down on the old man. Good. Very good. The old man looked at Yi Shiwen. It seemed as if he could see that Yi Shiwen had made the breakthrough since he looked quite pleased. However, it was hard to tell whether he was appreciating Yi Shiwen's breakthrough or the depth of his foundation. Yi Shiwen returned to the hidden star peak after he had bid farewell to the old man. Junior brother, you came back. Yi Shiwen had returned to the hidden star peak. And he had deliberately touched the matrix formation to inform Yang Wenjun and Deng Shui Xian about his arrival. They weren't the youngest experts on the hidden star peak. However, they had to play the role of the gatekeepers of the hidden star peak, since Yi Shiwen wasn't present for 3 years. Their aptitudes were inferior when compared to that of Bai Jiansong and the others. And their heart wasn't that wild either. However, they never complained about the irresponsible Yi Shiwen, who kept running around all over the place. They also knew that it was impossible for Yi Shiwen to stay put and guard the hidden star peak, since he had already gained the attention of the high-level experts of the university. However, they would often complain that a few people must be grabbed in the next term, so that they themselves could be liberated from this guarding duty. We haven't seen each other in 3 years. However, senior brother and senior sister still look as graceful as before. Congratulations. Yi Shiwen exposed a smile. Then he stepped forward, cupped his hands in obeisance and spoke. They were referring to each other as junior and senior. However, there wasn't much difference between the ages of these 3 people. But they had extremely cordial relations. Hey, how are you? Wait, you haven't reached the Sage Realm, have you? Yang Wenjun greeted in reply, but he got surprised as soon as he saw Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen had recently made the breakthrough, so his aura wasn't restrained in a proper manner. So this had been discovered by them. No, I haven't reached the Sage Realm. I have just made the breakthrough to the intermediate stage of the semi-Sage Realm. Yi Shiwen didn't need to hide anything from these 2 people. There's no mistake. You are indeed at the intermediate stage of the semi-Sage Realm. But why do I have a feeling that you don't seem different than your senior sister and me? We would have been sad and conflicted if that had been the case. Yang Wenjun spoke with a sense of grief in his tone. His face exposed a look of suffering. Yi Shiwen thoughtlessly laughed out loud. But he would dare to bet that Yang Wenjun was pretending at this moment. He had noticed that his abnormal senior brother and senior sister, they were too mediocre. This wasn't to say that they were weaker than other people. However, they lacked competitive spirit. Fortunately, these 2 persons didn't have big ambitions or intention to compete. Otherwise, they might have died from excessive anger after seeing Yi Shiwen's progress. You're laughing. Are you making fun of me and your senior brother Yang? Deng Shui Xian put her hands on her waist. She looked bitterly at Yi Shiwen as she said, I wouldn't dare. Yi Shiwen had no choice but to ask for forgiveness when Deng Shui Xian challenged him. He had learnt an important lesson from his both lives. Arguing with a woman was the stupidest thing. Oh, by the way, where is third brother? I didn't see him here. Yi Shiwen promptly changed the topic and asked. Third brother has recently gone out. He has been called by the master. So, only the 2 of us are present on the hidden star peak. Deng Shui Xian pouted and replied somewhat resentfully. These fellow brothers aren't reliable at all. They look for an opportunity to run away from the hidden star peak without thinking about it. Deng Shui Xian had completely disregarded the second sister since she had been undergoing closed-door training on the hidden star peak for years. However, Yi Shiwen also knew that second sister had been undergoing training for decades like a madman. In fact, he hadn't seen her even once. So, there was no difference between her absence and presence. By the way, I forgot to tell you. Yang Wenjun patted his forehead and said, Junior brother, someone from your family sent a letter 1 month ago. It says that your parents have invited you for the marriage of your elder sister. Marriage? Yi Shiwen was left dumbstruck. His brain had seemingly short-circuited, and he could only utter this one word in bewilderment. Time had become an insignificant word for him, ever since he had started to cultivate. 10 years, or even 100 years were nothing for experts who practice martial arts. In fact, even a Xiantian expert had the lifespan of 200 years. He had been thinking about this issue of time ever since he crossed through to this world 10 years ago. Chapter 473. An unforeseen event in the Great Yu State. More than 10 years had passed in a flash. Yi Shiwen wasn't a teenager anymore. In fact, he would be a bit older than his elder sister if he were placed in his previous life. But there was nothing he could do about this subject. The martial art warriors used to marry quite late. and the more powerful experts used to marry even later. In fact, many martial art warriors even chose to live alone throughout their lives. It was human nature to get married and have children, and this would give them a constant sense of life. But the powerful martial art experts used to live for 1,000 years, perhaps several thousand years. So such significance hardly existed for them. This letter arrived 1 month ago? The wedding may have ended by now, Yi Shiwen said in a somewhat depressed tone. There was no difference between day and night when these experts were undergoing closed-door training. So time would pass within the blink of an eye. It simply meant nothing to them. However, he still became a bit depressed because he couldn't attend his sister's wedding. He looked at that letter which Yang Wenjun was holding. One glance was enough to tell him that it was his father Yi Kongming's handwriting. His father had faintly inquired about his current life at first. Then he had briefly described about things that had happened over there. It seemed as if he wasn't that worried about Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen was touched by this. He knew that Yi Kongming had such nature. He may be concerned, but he would ask in a very brief manner. He wouldn't reveal his concern. However, he was genuinely very much concerned about him in reality. This made Yi Shiwen recall his father from his previous life. Wasn't he also like that? The passage of 10 years' time hadn't made memories of his previous life fuzzy. On the contrary, they had become more and more clear. Yi Shiwen knew that this was his mental obsession. Many people would say that mental obsession was bad, and it would be better if one could get rid of it. However, he himself knew that he wouldn't have reached till here if he didn't have this mental obsession. Yi Shiwen had received a letter for the first time in these 10 years. Yi Yuan School was located thousands of miles away from here, and it wasn't easy to send a letter from there. However, it wasn't impossible either. He knew that his family didn't wish for him to worry about other things. They didn't want his mind to get distracted from the way of martial arts. Yi Shiwen looked at the time on the invitation card. The wedding was scheduled to take place today. He immediately collected the invitation card and replied, "Thanks a lot, senior brother and senior sister, for receiving this letter on my behalf. I won't say much. I must leave now. The time is limited." He didn't wish to stay here any longer. He had never been in a position where he wanted to go back home so desperately. He certainly wouldn't have been late to reach home if this had happened earlier. However, his strength had increased significantly by now. It could be even compared with the strength of a peak expert of the initial stage of the Sage Realm. So, things had become very different now. He had only stepped on the ancient road back then. He was still young and immature at that time. However, he had already grown up now, and had become famous everywhere. "Okay, young brother, you must go now. Say hello to uncle and aunt on our behalf," Deng Shui Xian said. She knew that Yi Shiwen was very eager to go home, so she didn't say much. "And then I will take my leave. We will talk again once I return." Yi Shiwen finished speaking, and his devil wings suddenly stretched out from his back. It seemed as if 2 huge clouds were hanging in the sky. The wings then began to flutter. After that, Yi Shiwen transformed into a golden streak of light, and disappeared before their eyes. Damn it. Young brother has become even more abnormal. He couldn't help but exclaim as he saw Yi Shiwen disappear from his line of sight within no time. Junior brother is different from us. He has boundless future prospects. Maybe we can only count on him for handling the big matters of the hidden star peak in the future. Deng Shui Xian said. Well, forget it. I can see that junior brother and the third brother have become more and more powerful of late. However, it is useless to depend on these people for handling an inheritance. We will have to take this burden on our shoulders. We will have to work hard and endure the hardships. Yang Wenjun laughed and concluded. Deng Shui Xian shot a glance at him. However, she didn't refute either. After all, the hidden star peak would have revived countless times if it had been useful to depend on these so-called powerful people. The hidden star peak had given shelter to a very few disciples in the past. However, each of them was an invincible expert. However, the hidden star peak had still remained deserted. There was no problem when it came to guarding the inheritance and its resources. However, these powerful people had never really thought about carrying it forward or reviving it. The true martial university became smaller and smaller behind Yi Shiwen. He was flying at an extremely fast speed. However, he faced no obstruction on the way. Thanks to his current status, his wings fluttered unceasingly as he flew over the ancient road. Yi Shiwen had experienced life or death for more than a year's time on this road in the days of the past. And he had tempered himself until he had arrived at the gate of the true martial university. This 10 years' time had passed very quickly, and he once again was flying past those familiar places. So he couldn't help but feel nostalgic. This ancient road didn't look deserted even though 10 years had passed. It had vaguely retained the legends of the people of this generation. And a new generation would step on this ancient road after this cycle of 100 years would complete. And they would repeat everything their seniors had done. Everything would happen again in the next cycle. There was a massive difference between Yi Shiwen's current martial power and what he possessed in the past. The golden light that was emitting from his body had nearly ripped apart the vast sky. He had already returned to the 10 countries of the southeastern region from the true martial university in half a day's time. He could clearly see the border between Ming Empire and the 10 countries of southeast region. It's not that far. Yi Shiwen sighed and said. He couldn't help but feel homesick because he was returning home. Several people had started the journey along with him back then. However, he was returning alone. Jian Wuchun was in the true martial university. The wolf cub had returned to the demon island. And Yi Mo was indulged in a deep sleep. Therefore, these people were no longer with him even though only 1 decade had passed. The Yuan school was located in Great Yu State, and one could say that it was the only place he could call home in this world. Therefore, he couldn't help but feel that unavoidable feeling of nostalgia since he was returning home. However, he was surprised to see the situation as soon as he stepped onto the land of the Great Yu State. It could be said that this situation wasn't merely far beyond his imagination, rather. It was far more severe than what he could have imagined. The entire place was enveloped in the flames of war. There was chaos everywhere. The Great Yu State had seen a few flames of war in the past, but it had still maintained its tranquility. However, he was surprised to find that the entire Great Yu State had apparently sunk into the conflagration of war at this time. The flames had even spread up to the villages, and he could hear the loud screams. It was evident that the army had attacked the cities and towns, and had wreaked havoc everywhere. Moreover, these weren't the soldiers of the Great Yu State alone. Soldiers of many neighboring countries were present as well. What's going on? Yi Shiwen was somewhat baffled. He had already killed hundreds of rioting soldiers on his way since they were causing chaos. In fact, some of them had died red-eyed in disbelief when they had seen that Yi Shiwen had dared to attack them. However, all of them had gotten killed by Yi Shiwen. After all, he wasn't young and inexperienced like he used to be 10 years ago. Moreover, he wasn't afraid of anyone in the southeast region. Suddenly, 2 figures shot across the sky at a great speed. One figure was that of a man, and the other was of a woman. The man was approximately 25 or 26 years old. He was clad in a magnificent robe. He was carrying a noble aura which was quite suppressing. And that woman was approximately 20 years old. She was also clad in a magnificent robe, just like that man. However, both of them swiftly swept past Yi Shiwen in panic. Disciples of the drifting cloud city? Yi Shiwen was surprised for a moment. He hadn't expected that he would see the disciples of the drifting cloud city here. The disciples of the drifting cloud city and the royal clan of the Great Yu State were the closest with respect to the other forces. This was basically because they were the descendants of some noble of the Great Yu State. And this was also the reason why they dressed up in such luxurious clothes. However, he couldn't ponder any further since he got interrupted soon enough. Stop! A loud shout came from above. Yi Shiwen looked up, and he was surprised to see a group of experts. They were all clad in silver robes. They were flying high up in the sky. They arrived near him with a whizzing sound, and surrounded those 3 people. Are you the people of the Silver Light Mountain Village? Yi Shiwen frowned and asked. He had studied about each of the forces of the southeast region after he had returned from the Demon Island. This Silver Light Mountain Village was a big force of the Great Wu State, and it was a sworn enemy of the Great Yu State. Its influence and position in the Great Wu state was the same as that of the Yuan schools in the Great Yu state. However, these people weren't allowed to enter the Great Yu state. Otherwise, they would provoke many of the great forces of the Great Yu state. The forces which were its sworn enemies would obviously be provoked, even more than the other ones. However, they were the reason behind the present situation of the Great Yu state. The Great Yu state had been forced into this position because the sworn enemy force had penetrated so deep into its territory. This was an extremely dangerous situation. The 5 forces of the Great Yu state harbored secret enmity against each other, and each of them continually plotted against the other from the shadows. However, their attitude towards foreign forces was unanimously consistent. Who are you? The majority of the experts in this group of Silver Light Mountain Village were at the Truth Realm. Some of them were also legendary experts. What the hell is going on here? Yi Shiwen frowned and shouted coldly. How audacious! A person shouted angrily. This man looks like a surviving member of one of the 5 forces of the Great Yu state. Grab him as well. A person suggested. Surviving member? Yi Shiwen squinted. His big hand immediately swept out, and the person who had given that suggestion got grabbed by him. It seemed as if an eagle had grabbed a chick. This peak expert of the Truth Realm was no better than an ant in Yi Shiwen's grasp. He wasn't worthy of being Yi Shiwen's opponent. Can someone tell me what is going on here? Yi Shiwen asked. There wasn't any problem in the Great Yu state 2-3 months ago during the time when that letter was sent to him. Otherwise, his father wouldn't have agreed to his sister's marriage under these circumstances. So, what had happened within such a short time of 2 to 3 months? Who are you? Do you want to become an enemy of our Silver Light Mountain Village? A person stepped forward and spoke up. He looked very afraid of Yi Shiwen. After all, a Truth Realm expert was trapped within Yi Shiwen's grasp, and simply had no strength to fight back. He had been casually nabbed by Yi Shiwen. That man and woman also felt a sense of security. They had hurriedly swept past this man a moment ago. So, they hadn't seen him properly, and didn't know who he was. However, he obviously wasn't an enemy. Let him go quickly. Otherwise you will die. Even the force you belong to shall be destroyed. So it's better if you join our Silver Light Mountain Village's side. And we will guarantee that you won't die. Else, we will make you die without a grave to rest inside. The lead expert of that group threatened. Poochie. That man's voice had hardly faded away at this time. But Yi Shiwen had already crushed that Truth Realm expert to death. The blood splashed out. Chapter 474. I'll wait for them to come. You tell me what the matter is? Why have these people arrived in the Great Yu state? Yi Shiwen faintly asked from that man and woman who stood behind him. These two hadn't seen Yi Shiwen's face clearly. However, they thought that he must be an expert of the older generation of their Great Yu state when they heard his question. Moreover, he had also showed an extremely incredible strength when he had effortlessly crushed a Truth Realm expert, as if the man had been a piece of trash. It had seemed as easy as blowing off dust for him. Only a senior expert could have such strength in their opinion. Moreover, this senior expert might not have returned to the Great Yu state for a long time. This was also a normal thing. After all, it was quite difficult for powerful experts to make breakthroughs while staying in the Great Yu state. Moreover, there wasn't a good place in the entire 10 countries of the Southeast region where they could make breakthroughs. Therefore, they must go outside in order to increase their knowledge and experience. And they must seek various kinds of adventures and opportunities. This was what the majority of people chose to do. Therefore, meeting such wandering senior experts was also very normal. Welcome back, senior expert. That man came over and spoke respectfully. That man's explanation informed Yi Shiwen that mind-blowing changes had occurred in the last few months. A senior expert of the Great Qi State had been traveling outside the nation for a long time. The Great Qi State was also one of the 10 countries of the Southeast region. However, this expert had suddenly returned to his nation. Moreover, he was a sage expert. The royal clan of the Great Qi State had one sage expert for keeping watch in the past. But, they suddenly had more than one sage expert now. Consequently, the Great Qi State had become the top country among all. The true martial university had many sage experts. However, the true martial university governed the entire southern region, and the 10 countries of the southeastern region were only a small portion of the southern region. So, it was equivalent to an isle in the vast ocean. A sage expert was enough to run amok in the 10 countries of the southeast region. They could establish a sect, and could even become the senior ancestor of some force. This state had become one of the top among the 10 countries since they had a sage expert to keep watch. And having 2 such experts was enough to be ranked at the first spot. Moreover, the most dreadful thing was that this sage-level old ancestor had also brought many sage experts along with him. It was said that he had become friends with these experts when he was traveling, and all of them had arrived in the southeast region at this time. This had enormously inflated the Great Qi state's ambition, and they had wiped out 5 or 6 countries within a short time. They didn't exactly eliminate the forces of those countries. Rather, they made them the subordinate forces of the royal clan of the Great Qi state. It seemed as if this Silver Light Mountain village of the Great Wu state had already become their subordinate force as well. Then the people of the Silver Light Mountain village had gone on expedition for the Great Qi state to other countries. Consequently, these people had burned down towns, killed, and looted more and more people. Especially after they had entered the Great Yu state. They hadn't shrunk from any crime because the Great Yu state and the Great Wu state had harbored mutual grudges since a long time. Therefore, their forces obviously had mutual enmity. Moreover, the forces of the Great Yu state had more grudges amongst themselves as compared to grudges among the forces of the 2 countries. So, it had become a child's play for the Great Qi state. The Great Yu state had nearly collapsed under the attacks of the allied armies of the Great Qi state. They had been defeated again and again. They had lost a large area of their territory as well. Even the main gate of the Yiyuan school had been besieged. In fact, it was reckoned that the Yiyuan school would have surrendered as well if it hadn't been for the intrepid barrier formation that had been left behind by its ancient founder. However, there was an imminent danger even so. The imperial clan had suffered disastrous loss. Moreover, the Heavenly Wind Hall was one of the 5 big forces, and it had become an ally of the Great Qi state. After that, the Blood Spirit sect had also become restless, and started to have thoughts of joining the Great Qi state. In short, the present situations of all the forces of the Great Yu state had become more and more unfavorable. Moreover, it was expected that more and more forces would surrender to the Great Qi state with the passage of time, and nobody would be able to turn around this hopeless situation at that time. Many people had become helpless in front of the ambitions of the Great Qi state, because they couldn't stop them. The Great Qi obviously wanted to become an empire. Yi Shiwen also came to know that the allied armies of the Great Qi state would once again besiege the true martial university. The drifting cloud city had merged with the imperial city because of such a grim situation, and the 2 forces had become fiercer after having joined hands. The Yiyuan school had already suffered huge losses because of the invasion of the devil worship cult in the past. So, they had become a delicious cake in the eyes of the allied force of the Great Qi state. The Heavenly Wind Hall had already surrendered among the 5 big forces of the Great Yu state, and Blood Spirit sect wasn't far from surrendering either. Moreover, the Drifting Cloud City and the Imperial clan had formed an alliance. So the Yiyuan school had become the easy target for the allied armies. Moreover, the allied force could even deter the Blood Spirit sect, and could force them to surrender once the Yiyuan school had been eliminated. Therefore, the Yiyuan school was facing its biggest crisis since the invasion of the devil worship cult. Yi Shiwen didn't think of staying here for long after he realized this. Those experts of the Silver Light Mountain village had seen that Yi Shiwen had crushed that truth expert to death without any hesitation. So they knew that this matter wouldn't end well since this man before their eyes was an extremely dreadful person. After all, he had effortlessly crushed a truth expert to death. Something like this was impossible even for a legendary expert. Such strength had made their leader feel an extremely dangerous aura. He had become extremely bewildered, and had issued a signal for help. That person felt a bit relieved after he had issued the distress signal. The reinforcements will come soon enough. And this person's tyranny would be futile once that happens. He would regret this even if he were to be a sage expert. Sage expert. A feat as magnificent as the slaughter of a sage expert was something he had never been a part of. However, such brutal thoughts had started to flash through the mind of that chief expert. A sage expert was a mythical character for the experts of the Southeast region. The Southeast region had limited environment, so it was quite difficult to make breakthroughs up to sage realm in this territory, unless one was an extraordinary person. And those who could pull it off had become old and frail in the process. They didn't have potential left as a result. Therefore, the person with even the slightest of ambitions would often choose to travel outside in order to make the breakthrough into the sage realm. And they would only return after they had become a sage expert, if they had reached their end limit. Otherwise, they would often not come back. Therefore, the sage realm was often synonymous to God for the people of the Southeast region. And slaughtering a sage expert was almost like killing a god. Therefore, this taboo-like feeling had made him a bit excited and oppressive. Killing a sage expert was an enormous thing for him. And he perhaps wouldn't get another opportunity in his entire lifetime. Have you informed them? Yi Shiwen softly asked. However, that man heard it very clearly. And he thought that Yi Shiwen was afraid when he heard this. His aura had seemed somewhat dispirited and sluggish earlier, but it suddenly grew strong. He arrogantly looked at Yi Shiwen and replied, "So what? I know you're afraid. It's still not too late to join us." His voice hadn't faded when a big golden hand fell from the sky, and it pounded on that group of experts from the Silver Light Mountain village like a golden cloud. It grabbed them at once and transformed them into a group of blood fog. All of them had been killed within the grasp of that big hand. Who is this man? How can he be so frightening? The man behind Yi Shiwen was stunned as he saw this. He had never thought that he would see such a terrifying scene. This man was extremely powerful. He could think of only one sentence in his mind. He is a sage expert. He had crushed a truth expert to death a while ago. However, he had now killed a group of experts at once. Moreover, many legendary experts had been present in that group. However, they were nothing more than paper tigers in front of Yi Shiwen. Who is this senior? How is he so terrifying? He's perhaps a sage expert. Such an expert must be very famous. How come we haven't seen him before? The woman added. Senior. That man who stood behind Yi Shiwen insolently said to him. Senior, you must be careful. Those people of the Silver Light Mountain village aren't far away from here. There may be an old monster of sage realm among them. It's fine. I will wait for them to come. Yi Shiwen grinned and exposed his white teeth. However, the chilling cold look flourished more and more in his eyes. Who are you? How did you dare to kill the people of our Silver Light Mountain village? A loud shout came from afar. Dozens of people came flying from afar. Each of them was a legendary expert. Even a few semi-sage experts were present among them. They had rushed over here like a swarm of bees after they had received the distress signal. Yi Shiwen looked at these experts of the Silver Light Mountain village with his ice-cold eyes. The number of legendary experts in the Light Mountain village wasn't many in comparison to the Yuan school. There were only a few dozen legendary experts. However, it could be said that they had turned out in full strength in order to help the Qi State's army expeditions. So it would be quite pitiful if they died. A surviving member of the Yu State has dared to provoke the experts of our Silver Light Mountain village. Don't you want to live? The leading expert of that group shouted. The principles were faintly fluctuating on his body. He was a senior expert of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. He must be a top-notch expert of the ancestor class. Such kind of person had arrived. So it was clearly visible how positive the Silver Light Mountain village was on this matter. Surviving member? The Yu State hasn't extinguished yet. In fact, you look like the surviving members of the Wu State to my eyes. Yi Shiwen coldly laughed. No, you are merely acting like other people's dog at this time. You're like a mad dog that bites people everywhere. Yi Shiwen's words had pierced the hearts of these people of the Silver Light Mountain village. These people could be considered as the people of a subjugated nation. They had certainly surrendered to the Qi State. However, they could still feel the humiliation in their hearts. Everyone was initially free in their nation. However, they had suddenly become other people's slave after their surrender. They were pretending to be treated equally on the surface. However, everyone knew that it was impossible. And Yi Shiwen's words had exposed the scars that these people had deliberately ignored. This was a huge insult to them. "You little bastard. How dare you be so insolent?" That old ancestor of the late stage of the semi-sage realm clenched his teeth. "I would like to show you that you can't even overcome this slave from a subjugated nation." His cold and gloomy vision could pierce people's hearts. Chapter 475. Is that Yi Shiwen? "Little bastard, you shouldn't have been insolent." That old ancestor of the late stage of the semi-sage realm clenched his teeth and spoke. "I will ensure that your Yu state gets vanquished without even getting enslaved." The more that old ancestor of the late stage of the semi-sage realm spoke up, the more his imposing aura flourished. Yi Shiwen's aura appeared to be at the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. His aura was certainly profound, and could even scare a person. However, it was only at the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. So it was impossible for him to be a match for this expert of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. Destroyed. Yi Shiwen shot a glance at that man. He then unleashed the fire cloud's falling sky hand. However, it wasn't a red-colored fiery big hand this time. Rather, it was a golden hand. And the big hand was wrapped up in divinities. It seemed as if it had shattered the world itself as it pressed down. Some semi-sage experts of the Silver Light Mountain village attacked back. They wanted to stop Yi Shiwen's attack. However, it was simply futile. They were no match for him. And their attacks couldn't put a scratch on his body. Many experts had gathered in the surroundings by now. They found themselves stunned as they saw this scene unfold before their eyes. A majority of them had been scared to death by this spectacle. An expert of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm had dared to initiate an attack against several semi-sage experts and a group of legendary experts. Such courage was enough to frighten everyone to their core. Bang! 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 Yi Shiwen had been apprehensive ever since he had found out some concrete news about the Yuan school. So he didn't show the slightest mercy. The big hand struck those experts, and they fell to the ground one after another like dumplings in a pot. Their bodies crumbled by the impact of Yi Shiwen's slap, and the bones in their bodies got shattered. They had basically been slapped to death. Yi Shiwen grabbed that old expert of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. Then he grabbed his soul and read his memory. He finally came to know that the army of the Qi state had besieged the Yuan school. And thus, the most intense time had already arrived. Yi Shiwen didn't stop for even a minute, and immediately rushed forward. There appeared golden light under his feet as he strode forward. He shattered the void in the process. And he vanished before everyone's eyes. In fact, he didn't bother about that man and woman he had saved a moment ago either. "Who is this man? How he can be so terrifying?" someone asked. An extremely frightening incident had taken place before everyone's eyes. An entire group of experts were simply no match for Yi Shiwen, and had been slapped to death by him. That man looks a bit familiar. He is Yi Shiwen. He used to be a genius of the Yuan school more than a decade ago. He is that Yi Shiwen. Someone suddenly recalled Yi Shiwen. His words were filled with disbelief and speculation because he couldn't believe that the same person could be Yi Shiwen in reality. Yi Shiwen had been famous among many forces at that time. However, 10 years had passed in a wink. 10 years didn't mean anything for these martial arts experts. In fact, 10 years' time wasn't that long even for Xiantian experts. However, it was enough to make people forget about Yi Shiwen since he hadn't showed up in these 10 years. 10 years' time was enough to make many people forget about Yi Shiwen. Let alone, he used to be a mere junior disciple of the younger generation back then. Several groups of such young disciples often showed up every 100 years. And one such group of young people had slowly grown up in the wake of Yi Shiwen's absence. And they had gradually masked Yi Shiwen's glory with the passage of time. Many people had forgotten about Yi Shiwen. He had certainly awed everyone in the true martial university, and had become a heaven's pride expert of this generation. His name had shaken all directions. However, that was merely in the locality of the true martial university. The news about his exploits hadn't spread in the southeast region. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had been dormant in the past few years. Therefore, many people hadn't heard about his exploits of late. However, he didn't give them an opportunity to inquire, and disappeared before everyone's eyes. Everyone stared blankly at the direction in which Yi Shiwen had disappeared. They didn't know what to say for a moment. Who was this man? He was extremely terrifying even if he was that Yi Shiwen. He wasn't even a legendary expert when he had departed more than 10 years ago. And now, even the semi-sage experts couldn't withstand a single blow from him. Such strength is enough to rank him at the peak in the southeast region. He was so terrifying just now. That man and woman had complex feelings as they saw Yi Shiwen leave. He had turned around for an instant a moment ago, and they had gotten to see him very clearly. He was really Yi Shiwen. They and he belonged to the same generation. Initially, they were also the elites in the drifting cloud city. They also used to be the focus of public attention back then. However, they had been shrouded by Yi Shiwen's glory at that time. In fact, they had been overshadowed by him. Perhaps, he didn't remember that he once used to have two such rivals. However, they had always been impressed by him as well. He had been extremely powerful, to the extent that they wouldn't be able to forget him even if they wanted to. However, Yi Shiwen had faded away from their memories after he had departed a decade ago. And the experts of a new generation had grown up. So they had almost forgotten Yi Shiwen over time. However, he had again graced the southeast region with his presence and his extremely tyrannical attitude. The semi-sage experts appeared to be made of paper in front of him. They promptly crumbled by a mere touch of his. Were those semi-sage experts extremely weak? No. Rather, Yi Shiwen was too strong. They had believed that the gap between them and him must have decreased after 10 years. However, it hadn't decreased. In fact, it had widened beyond limit. I didn't expect that he would become so formidable in just 10 years. It's really incredible. That man of the drifting cloud city sighed and said, "Isn't this great? It will be a great help for us since he is so tyrannical." That woman added, "The Imperial clan and their drifting cloud city were the two forces among all the 5 big forces of Great Yu State which hadn't surrendered. So the fates of the two sides were tied together. And both of them would lose their honor if any one of them lost its. So, she couldn't help but be delighted after she saw that a formidable person had arrived for their help at this crucial time. The Imperial clan and Drifting Cloud City would have been afraid of a talent like Yi Shiwen of the Yuan school if things had been any different. In fact, they would have hated him because such person could have disturbed the balance of power among the 5 big forces. Consequently, the other 4 forces would have become the subordinate forces of the Yuan school. However, the true martial university had fortunately started to recruit the disciples at that time. And a group of the most formidable young geniuses who possess great power and wisdom had left Great Yu State. However, the matter seemed completely different at this time. Yi Shiwen had become more powerful. And he could become a savior for many forces of Great Yu State. They may have to become the Yuan school's subordinate forces. But it would be better than getting wiped out. These two couldn't help but have mixed feelings in their hearts. Let's go. Let's go and see. Yi Shiwen must have returned to Yuan school. So, we may get to see a startling battle this time. Yeah, let's go. Let's go together. Yi Shiwen was treading on the rainbow light. He was so anxious that he didn't even restrain his power. And his tyrannical aura ripped apart the sky as he streaked across the sky like a comet. In fact, the friction arising due to his forward motion ignited flames in the sky. He soon arrived at the main encampment of the Yuan school. However, he was surprised to see that several tyrannical matrix formations had been laid outside the station of the Yuan school in order to isolate it. Each of these matrix formations was more intensive than the other. And all of them were meshed together into a big matrix formation, and were strangling the great protective barrier of the Yuan school. Yi Shiwen immediately became angry. He flew above that big matrix formation. And he shot one punch. The power of his fist distorted the space, and ripped apart the sky. It then condensed into a huge star in the sky, and fell down. It was the Big Bang Stardust Fist. Bang! Everything disintegrated wherever that big star went. It seemed as if the world itself was going to disintegrate. The scene looked like something one would see on the Doomsday. It appeared like a bitter clash between two stars. Inexhaustible divine beams darted out everywhere and set off dreadful storms. These storms then swept across in all directions. This was the first time Yi Shiwen had attacked with his entire strength after he had made the breakthrough into the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. The attack carried dreadful might. This blast was like a scene on the day of Ragnarok. The entire big matrix formation got eliminated in a flash by Yi Shiwen's sudden attack. The terrifying shock waves didn't get any place to dissipate under Yi Shiwen's suppression, so they got released inside that big matrix formation. Countless experts were caught off guard and turned into dust. The big matrix formation had lost most of its power, but Yi Shiwen also had to use the entirety of his strength. His strength was equivalent to that of a peak expert of the initial stage of the Sage Realm. His attack already carried a bit of the Sage Realm's might, so it was exceptionally terrifying. "Who are you? How dare you attack our great Qi Empire?" A loud shout came from inside the crumbling big matrix formation. Many tyrannical figures came out from that matrix formation in quick succession. They possessed tyrannical Tao principles on their bodies. Their vigorous energies condensed together and soared into the sky. It then formed a pillar of energy in the sky. Their eyes looked cruel and untamed. All of them turned out to be the experts of the semi-sage realm. Moreover, almost all of them were the experts of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. These people were old monsters of various forces that had surrendered to Qi state, just like that old ancestor of the Silver Light Mountain village. And these people had assembled together and had then rushed towards Yi Shiwen. It wasn't surprising that the Silver Light Mountain village had surrendered. Such a force was enough to sweep away the entire southeast region. However, it would ultimately doom them to die at Yi Shiwen's hands. Surrender was understandable while facing a very strong enemy. However, they were willingly serving as the pawns of the Qi state at this time, and had invaded the Great Yu state. Such crime couldn't be forgiven. Yi Shiwen didn't stop as he saw the big matrix formation crumble. He strode forward and transformed into a golden dragon. And he swept past the semi-sage experts who had rushed towards him. The ones who came in contact with this golden light were sent flying. Poochie. Many of those semi-sage experts spouted blood from their mouth in quick succession, and their bodies went flying in the sky. Yi Shiwen's body was so intrepid that a mere collision with him had left them to spout blood. However, the extent to which their bones had been crushed as they had gone flying upside down wasn't clear. Everyone was left stunned as they saw this scene. They hadn't anticipated that they would see such a terrifying scene. Neither the people of the allied armies of the Qi state, nor the disciples of the Yuan school had thought that they would see such a terrifying scene. A group of extremely tyrannical semi-sage experts hadn't been able to withstand one blow from him. The disciples of the Yuan school had given up all hope. However, Yi Shiwen arrived at this time. He had showed up like a god, and had shattered the big matrix formation that had been giving them trouble for so many days in just one move. Moreover, that group of tyrannical and cruel experts of the semi-sage realm had been sent flying by a single attack of his. Chapter 476. Who is this man? How he can be so powerful? He looks like a devil god. How can a human be like this? The entire camp of the allied armies of Qi state had already been devastated. Yi Shiwen's one attack of the Big Bang Stardust Fist had devastated the entire big camp of the allied armies of the Qi state, and they had sustained heavy casualties as a result. Afterwards, a group of semi-sage experts were utterly defeated by his attack. Such strength had left them in despair. Consequently, they had become exceptionally afraid. And a chill ran down the spine of the surviving experts of the allied armies of the Qi state. This man is too ferocious. He had effortlessly wiped out a group of semi-sage experts. Was there genuinely a sage expert like that in the Yuan school? It was impossible. They had already inquired about this before they had arrived here. The Yuan school only had one sage expert, and that person was the old leader of the school. However, he had already died in a seated posture. Moreover, many people had witnessed that with their own eyes. And this matter hadn't made noise in the Great Yu state alone. In fact, it had also made a buzz in the entire 10 countries of the southeast region at that time. After all, it was regarding the death of a sage expert. A sage expert could run amok in a country, and could even be the ancestor of a region. So they absolutely couldn't have made a mistake regarding the matter of the death of a sage expert. They had time and again verified the death records of a person like the old leader to see if it wasn't bogus. And then they felt relieved in the end. Therefore, this person before their eyes couldn't be that legendary old leader. The martial arts experts could obviously maintain their youthful appearance. However, this person clearly wasn't too old. This meant that the person who had devastated the experts of the allied armies of the Qi state was someone else. The disciples of the Yi Yuan school were cheering in excitement. Those experts of the allied armies of Qi state didn't know Yi Shiwen, but most of the disciples of the Yi Yuan school knew him. Yi Shiwen had left a profound impression on them back then. He had been a latecomer, yet he had gained the fastest speed, and had become a prodisciple. And he had then gained an illustrious fame after he had returned from the Demon Island. Everyone had initially believed that Qi Fifan possessed invincible might among his peers. He possessed an unshakable position among his peers. In fact, he held a legendary status. 10 years' time had passed in a flash. And several groups of new disciples had arrived in the Yi Yuan school during this time. These people had also been hearing about how Yi Shiwen's fame was growing slowly. However, not many people knew him still. Yi Shiwen, it's Yi Shiwen. Many disciples of Yi Shiwen's generation immediately recognized him. This group of people were his peer, and were most familiar with him among the people of the Yi Yuan school. They had seen him rising step by step to become a prodisciple. Therefore, they were obviously touched the most. A small gap opened in the big matrix barrier of the Yi Yuan school, and Yi Shiwen went inside. Those experts of the allied armies of the Qi state didn't dare to launch an attack on him. After all, they weren't idiots. Hadn't they seen how formidable Yi Shiwen was? A group of semi-sage experts had been sent flying in the sky as soon as they collided with him. And they had sustained serious injuries as well. Therefore, they might meet their deaths if they tried to provoke this powerhouse any further. Yi Shiwen saw a group of familiar faces as soon as he went inside the big matrix barrier. And the head of that group turned out to be Chu Jingkai. 10 years had passed and Chu Jingkai looked extraordinary now. He had gotten promoted, and had become everyone's chief. His principles were faintly twined around his body. He had also become a respectable expert of the semi-sage realm. However, Yi Shiwen was merely a bit surprised, nothing more. After all, Chu Jingkai had already been at the pinnacle of the half-step legendary realm back then. Afterwards, he had reversed his cultivation into the legendary realm. Therefore, his speed must have become even faster. Moreover, he had stayed in the half-step legendary realm for over 100 years. So, he certainly had a profound accumulation as well. So his progress wasn't far from Yi Shiwen's expectations. However, his strength couldn't be compared with that of Huang Luoqian and Shuiyan Luo. Let alone with the strength of Qi Fifan and Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen also admired him secretly. After all, Chu Jingkai had chosen not to leave the Yi Yuan school at that time. His cultivation wouldn't have been comparable to Qi Fifan's at present, but it could have well been comparable to that of Huang Luoqian's and Shuiyan Luo's if had decided otherwise. His attire made it seem like he had already become the head of the Yi Yuan school. Yi Shiwen saw the former head of the Yi Yuan school Wu Patian standing behind him. In addition, he also saw the familiar figures of the Lord of the Penalty Palace Hall and the Lord of the Merit Palace Hall. However, their attires gave an impression that they were no longer the in-charges, and the experts of the younger generation had taken over their positions. He had already seen a lot of these people back in the day. Many of them were the trusted aides of Qi Fifan. In the end, Qi Fifan had officially taken the control of the Yi Yuan school in his hands. So having his trusted aides in the team should naturally make sense. These people wouldn't have become the puppets of the sovereign of the school if he didn't plan to assign them to the important positions. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but be secretly moved. The power structure of the Yi Yuan school had been completely transferred into the hands of the people of this generation in this short period of more than a decade. It was even quicker than what he had expected. However, the younger generation had also grown up extremely quickly. A person like Chu Jingkai, who had been clearly inspired by Yi Shiwen at that time, had also put more efforts into his cultivation. And he had made the breakthrough into semi-sage realm within such a short span of 10 years. He had fully demonstrated his 100-year worth of accumulation of legendary realm. Young brother Yi, I didn't expect that we would meet each other under these circumstances. Chu Jingkai's face exposed a bit of agony as he said. Both of them hadn't anticipated that they would meet in such situation. Yi Shiwen had also thought that he would return to his home in glory. However, he hadn't anticipated that he would return in this kind of situation. I hadn't thought of that either. Yi Shiwen replied. Sai, I'm incompetent. I couldn't lead the Yi Yuan school on the correct path. I'm unworthy of being the leader of the Yi Yuan school. Chu Jingkai sighed. He forced a smile and said, Don't pay attention to what I say. Thanks a lot to young brother Yi for coming today and helping us out. It's not a big deal. Yi Shiwen waved his hand to show that he wasn't bothered by this matter. It's not a big deal? Chu Jingkai exclaimed and said. It may not be a big deal for you, brother Yi, but was nothing less than a hopeless situation for us. Young brother Qi had sent a letter 1 year ago, and he had conveyed that you have made a huge name in the true martial university. He and Qi Fifan didn't have any conflicts. They didn't have a very friendly relationship either. However, their relation had become quite good after Qi Fifan had left. Chu Jingkai was deeply moved at this moment. Yi Shiwen wasn't the only person who had gone to the true martial university, and he didn't get time to send letter to his home. However, that didn't mean that other people didn't get the time as well. They got to know from the letters that Yi Shiwen had established a big reputation in the true martial university. At least, these high-level experts had come to know about it. Therefore, he was even more touched. The true martial university wasn't a small place like the Yi Yuan school. Standing out among one's peers was no big deal in Yi Yuan school, but one must say that Yi Shiwen had outstanding innate talent, because he had stood out among his peers in the true martial university. Moreover, he had also won the championship in the big competition between the 4 major forces. In addition, he had also become the top heaven's pride expert of this generation. Everyone had seen Yi Shiwen's power a moment ago. A group of semi-sage experts had appeared like paper in front of him. They had been no match for him. His strength had even stunned the true martial university. It was very difficult to make the breakthrough into the sage realm in the 10 countries of the southeastern region. The semi-sage realm was considered as the peak fighting strength one could have here. However, even that didn't look enough in front of Yi Shiwen. Some people may have had doubts that whether the information sent by Qi Fifan was true or false, but they had nothing to say at this time. A group of semi-sage experts had been effortlessly tidied up by Yi Shiwen. So, who could say that this rumor was false? Senior brother Chu is overpraising me. Yi Shiwen replied in a neither obsequious nor supercilious manner. He would often remind himself about the ancient Phoenix world. And he was still far worse in comparison. He might not be able to bring her back in his entire lifetime if he would be self-satisfied because of other people's praises. We are lucky to have you this time. Otherwise, we didn't know when we would have gotten besieged. The elder of the Merit Palace Hall opened his mouth and spoke up. Even though he had advanced to become an ancient elder of the school, but he still had a huge influence in the Merit Palace Hall. He and Yi Shiwen had shared good relations in the past. He had helped Yi Shiwen a lot in those days. So, Yi Shiwen was very grateful to him. However, the complexion of the elder of the Penalty Palace Hall didn't look very good. Everyone knew about the way his attitude had been towards Yi Shiwen at that time. He and Yi Shiwen had a big argument, especially regarding the Luo clan's matter. He had repeatedly spread rumors about Yi Shiwen, and had said that Yi Shiwen was a cruel and undisciplined person. He had further advocated that the Yi Yuan school would have to pay the price for his actions sooner or later. However, the final result had changed into this. Yi Yuan school's big protective barrier was in an imminent danger a moment ago. The enemy's big matrix formation would have possibly breached it if Yi Shiwen hadn't attacked on time. Therefore, the people of the Penalty Palace Hall were a bit nervous to see Yi Shiwen. They were afraid that Yi Shiwen would settle the previous debts this time. And they would have no other choice but to extend their necks for execution if Yi Shiwen decided to settle the debts of the past at this time. However, Yi Shiwen didn't have time to bother about these people. He went straight into the Yiyuan school. Chu Jingkai explained the present situation of the Yiyuan school to him on the way. Yiyuan school had no choice but to give shelter to the personnel of the other sects of various regions, while facing the attack of the allied armies of the Qi state. The said personnel unfortunately had to abandon their sections. However, these people were fundamentally everything. Otherwise, what would be the use of a sect if its people were dead? They clearly knew this truth. The interior of the Yiyuan school looked as if it was already ready for war. Every floating peak was already flying. They were patrolling around the Yiyuan school. The Qianyu Peak had been completely transformed by Yi Shiwen in the past. And it looked most glamorous among all floating peaks because it had been designed for a prototype. So it was a bit bigger compared to the ordinary floating peaks. And then again, it had also been reinforced by Yi Shiwen. However, those reinforcements and arrangements and so on appeared extremely childish in the eyes of the current Yi Shiwen. He could easily break them any time he wanted to. What about my father and mother? Yi Shiwen felt a bit relieved as he heard Chu Jingkai's explanation about things. So he was mostly worried about the safety of his family members since they were present in the Qingfeng Mountain Sub-School. Chapter 477. Chapter 477. Meets friends and family again. They are fine. Chu Jingkai began to talk about them. Yi Shiwen came to know from Qi Yongkai's explanation that great changes had occurred here in the last 10 years. It wasn't that only he had progressed. Even his father Yi Kongming had been called in a few years ago, and had been given the responsibility of an elder in the main sect of the Yiyuan school. So his life was settled now. And even his elder brother and second sister had been recognized as key cultivators by the management. They were young and had already reached the small complete level of the truth realm. Yi Shiwen knew how much this change was related to himself. The Yiyuan school was naturally going to put more effort into nurturing his elder brother and second sister after they had witnessed his outstanding performance in the true martial university. After all, even his elder brother and elder sister were outstanding talents of his generation. They certainly weren't geniuses like him. The ancient road would open again after several decades, and the true martial university would again begin to recruit new disciples. So it wasn't that they wouldn't become outstanding experts of another generation. After all, they were still less than 50 years old. So they still had a long way to go. Originally, he would have also participated in the recruitment test of the true martial university several decades later, just like his siblings. However, he managed to get recruited ahead of time, and nothing more. These big forces were thousands of years old, and had produced many sage experts. However, these sage experts wouldn't stay for long, and they were also unlikely to come back in the future as well. However, the successors of those sage experts had always been given special importance in the sect because the said sage experts might save the sect from calamity in the future if their successors were living in the sect. Yi Shiwen became relaxed after he came to know that his family members were fine. The Qi state's army is retreating. The Qi state's army is retreating. Someone shouted. Suddenly, the sound of disciples' clamor sounded outside, and the cheers sounded throughout the Yiyuan school. Chu Jingkai also let out a sigh of relief. He looked at Yi Shiwen with a grateful expression in his eyes. Everyone knew that Yiyuan school's breach was merely a matter of time if Yi Shiwen hadn't returned on time. The Yiyuan school had been besieged second time. One could say that the enemies hadn't been prepared when they had attacked the Yiyuan school for the first time. However, they had come prepared this time. And the Yiyuan school had been pushed to the verge of collapse under such a disastrous attack. However, the entire Qi state's allied forces then suffered a disastrous loss under Yi Shiwen's unexpected attack. So they had no choice but to retreat. Yi Shiwen didn't wish to chase and kill them because he knew that these people were nothing more than small goons. So, what was the point of kill these small goons if those genuine experts still hadn't been taken care of? These bastards are finally leaving. Fortunately, Senior Yi Shiwen has returned this time. Otherwise, the consequences would have been disastrous. Suddenly, several experts began to stretch their heads to look at Yi Shiwen as they clamored. They previously couldn't think of anything else because they were nervous since the Qi state's allied forces were camped outside. However, they had become relaxed at this time since the enemy forces had retreated. And they also knew that the enemy wouldn't come again for the time being. So they were finally paying attention to Yi Shiwen en masse. Yi Shiwen was a great and legendary character for the people of this generation. He had rushed to the top by defeating countless experts in the process. He had gained outstanding achievements and fame. He had earned an illustrious reputation, not only in Yiyuan School, but also in the true martial university. Is that really Yi Shiwen? A junior disciple asked with curiosity. Everyone had heard legends about Yi Shiwen. However, not many people had seen him in reality. Indeed he is. Didn't you see the school head talking to him? Gee, didn't you see he looked like a god when he had broken that huge matrix formation of those Qi State's dogs a while ago? He is extremely ferocious. Someone replied with admiration. Of course, those old semi-sage experts were sent flying as soon as they collided with him. They looked like paper tigers before him. I think he may have entered the sage realm. Sage realm? Who can dare to bully us if we have a sage expert to keep watch over us? Several experts of the younger generation had become curious when they saw Yi Shiwen. In fact, they had even started to make guesses about his strength. He was too far beyond their reach. However, they still made such unscrupulous guesses, with a bit of curiosity and adoration in their tones. These people weren't like him. They and Yi Shiwen were considered of the same generation in the days of the past. In fact, some of them had even fought with him. But most of them had bitterness written over their faces. After all, they used to be his rivals at some point. However, he had matured and they looked so insignificant in front of him. Master, is that Yi Shiwen? A sturdy figure was standing far away on a mountain peak. It was a young warrior clad in a magnificent warrior's attire. He was looking at the distant crowd from that peak. Everyone had gathered around Yi Shiwen, as if he were a revered leader. Yi Shiwen would have been surprised to see this person if he were here. It was his old rival Emo Han. Emo Han used to be at the small complete level of the Xiantian realm at that time. However, he had steadily entered into the truth realm in these 10 years. A young boy was standing behind him. He looked approximately 16 or 17 years old. He had become a bit curious as he looked at the crowd from afar. So he asked, "Yes, that's Yi Shiwen." Emo Han nodded. He was feeling the bitter pain in his heart. He had lost to Yi Shiwen in the past. So he had constantly put more and more effort to become stronger in his attempts to surpass Yi Shiwen. However, he had never imagined that the disparity between him and Yi Shiwen would get bigger and bigger. He had thought that Yi Shiwen would admire his progress when he would return from the true martial university. However, that didn't happen. In fact, Yi Shiwen might not even remember that he had one such rival in the past. Is he genuinely so powerful? That young boy curiously asked. He had heard countless fables regarding his legendary master. And his master had always played the role of a villain in these legends. And that was because Yi Shiwen had become a famous hero after his first fight in the Yiyuan school. Therefore, Emo Han's name had inevitably become famous as the person who had gotten crushed by Yi Shiwen in that fight. Next to nobody had been optimistic about Yi Shiwen at that time. However, their evaluations had completely changed regarding him soon after. Ferocious. Emo Han forced a smile on his face as he spoke. He was far more than just ferocious. The entire Yiyuan school had been sent shaking because of the Qi state's allied force, but they had been effortlessly defeated by Yi Shiwen in just one punch. Come on, let's go back. The Qi state's allied forces have withdrawn for now. However, we still have many things to do. Yi Shiwen didn't know what his former opponents were feeling in their hearts at this time. He had already arrived at the Qingyu Peak. He hadn't been accompanied by the high-level experts of the Yiyuan school because they had to handle other matters post the retreat of the Qi state allied forces. Young brother, you have finally returned. Yi Shiwen's elder sister arrived first to greet him as she saw him. 10 years had passed in an instant, and she wasn't a delicate and naive girl anymore. However, she was still as frank as before. Yi Shiwen's elder brother, Yi Feng, was behind his elder sister, Yi Ruxia. He was exceptionally touched when he saw Yi Shiwen. These two brothers hadn't seen each other since last 10 years. Yi Shiwen's father, Yi Kongming, and his mother, Xia Chunshui, were behind his brother. Yi Kongming looked calm and collected. A smile had appeared on his face when he had seen Yi Shiwen. However, his faintly shivering hand had revealed that he was emotionally moved in reality. Xia Chunshui was even more touched on the other side. In fact, she was repeatedly wiping her tears. She had always been near her younger son since his childhood. She hadn't given him birth. However, she had always treated him as her own son. And she had already counted the years for which Yi Shiwen had been away. More than 10 years in the true martial university. And also the several years that he had spent at the main sect of the Yiyuan school, a total of nearly 20 years. Father, mother. Yi Shiwen promptly stepped forward and knelt down to greet them with respect. He had always had a soft corner in his heart for his family. He knew that he might never be able to return to the earth. And even if he could, he couldn't tell how many months or years would have passed by then in Earth's time frame. His foster parents had become even more important to him as a result. And his identity, status, or strength wouldn't change that. Get up quickly. Xia Chunshui couldn't bear it when Yi Shiwen knelt down. She promptly advanced forward and helped him up with her hands. She said, "You've become so thin." Xia Chunshui had spoken this after she had observed Yi Shiwen carefully. He couldn't help but smile wryly in response. The experts on his level could maintain their physique for thousands of years without letting it change even a bit. Then how could he possibly become fat or thin? One could only say that it was a mother's unconditional concern towards her son, and nothing more. Very good, very good. Yi Kongming spoke up in an emotional tone as he carefully observed Yi Shiwen. He had always been calm and solemn. However, his face had revealed a bit of emotions in this moment. This clearly showed how touched he was. Another familiar woman had been standing behind Yi Kongming and Xia Chunshui this entire time. She was Zhang Sunyuan. She arrived in front of Yi Shiwen and greeted him in a graceful manner. She then spoke in a melodious voice, "Accept Yuan's greetings, brother-in-law." Yi Shiwen was surprised for a moment, and he immediately looked at his elder brother, Yi Feng, and said, "You got married?" He was somewhat puzzled. He had returned to attend his elder sister's wedding. However, he didn't expect that he would hear the good news that his elder brother and Zhang Sunyuan had gotten married as well. He already knew that the both of them were deeply in love, so getting married was just a matter of time. It was quite important for two martial cultivators to look for a lifelong companion. The so-called companion was one of the 4 key constituents of cultivation. The other 3 were land, principles, and wealth. And they made for a very lovely young couple. It seemed as if their match was made in heaven. In fact, Yi Shiwen had been very optimistic about them even back then. Well, yeah. Yi Feng felt a bit embarrassed and touched the back of his head. "I've been married for a while now. I had heard that you were undergoing closed-door training at that time. So I didn't disturb you." Yi Shiwen had no choice but to let out a smile. A young boy and a young girl arrived behind Zhang Sunyuan at this time. Both children weren't even 12 or 13 years old. The young boy's face exposed a heroic spirit. His forehead was quite similar to that of Yi Feng's. And that young girl was a baby face. However, she looked a bit like Zhang Sunyuan. She was a lovely child of a beautiful mother. "Yi Ning. Yi Ning Xian. Nice to meet you, uncle." Both children walked towards Yi Shiwen and knelt down in obeisance. Yi Feng introduced them to Yi Shiwen. They were his and Zhang Sunyuan's twin kids. They had been born more than 10 years ago. Shortly after Yi Shiwen had left for the true martial university, Yi Shiwen noticed that both kids had outstanding physical foundation and temperament. In fact, it was far better than that of his elder brothers and elder sisters when they were of this age. And he couldn't tell the difference between their current foundations and that of his own when he was at their age. They had already reached the peak strength of the Hotian realm at an early age of less than 12. They might even become Heaven's Pride experts in the future if trained properly. Chapter 478. Yi Shiwen had never stopped because of his physical foundation and aptitude. He didn't possess extremely outstanding body foundation and aptitude. However, he had still managed to come so far. Less than 12-year-old Xiantian experts could be found everywhere in the true martial university, let alone an evil genius like Xianyuan Palace Hall's Pang Yongbo, who was at the semi-sage realm. However, it could also be said that 12 to 13 years old Hotian experts in the Yiyuan school were nothing less than evil geniuses. They were much stronger than Yi Feng when he was at this age. And it was hard to guess how much stronger they were compared to Yi Shiwen when he had been at their age. Kids with such aptitude would have boundless future prospects if they were trained properly. So, it wasn't surprising that Yi Feng had introduced his kids so proudly. Good. Yi Shiwen laughed and said. He took out a chunk of dragon essence from the heavenly source mirror, and said, "This is a chunk of dragon essence. Both of you can divide it into smart parts and distribute among yourselves at the time of making a breakthrough in the future. It will enormously increase the chances of your breakthrough." This was Yi Shiwen's remaining stock of the dragon essence. It could do far more than merely increasing the chances of making a successful breakthrough. In fact, it could guarantee a successful breakthrough if used by a Hotian expert. Younger brother. Yi Feng hastily stopped Yi Shiwen and said, "It is an extremely precious item." "It's nothing." Yi Shiwen shook his head and said, "I am just giving them gifts for the first meeting." A dragon essence wasn't of great use to Yi Shiwen anymore. However, it would be an enormous treasure for Yi Ning and Yi Ning Xian. Yi Shiwen cared about his family the most. So this was nothing for him. "All right then, you can accept it." Yi Feng wasn't a pretentious person. So he didn't continue to haggle over this issue. "Thanks, third uncle." The two kids spoke in unison. Both of them were educated and well-mannered. Just like Yi Feng from back then. This made Yi Shiwen dote on them even more. Many senior members of the Qianyu faction had also become excited. So they had also gathered around Yi Shiwen apart from his family members. The Qianyu faction had progressed smoothly in these years. The Yiyuan school had also agreed to push for their development. However, these people knew that these things had happened because of Yi Shiwen. He had showed outstanding performance in the true martial university. And they had received great benefits because of this. It was the so-called case of getting benefits of being close to an influential person. Yi Shiwen also distributed great amounts of immortality pills. He often lacked spirit energy. However, he never lacked immortality pills. He had obtained great amount of heavenly treasures in the last 10 years or so. And a lot of them had been refined into pills by him. In fact, he had personally refined several immortality pills back when he was in the truth realm. However, these pills weren't of great use for the current Yi Shiwen. Therefore, he had decided to distribute them. Oh my god, this is the legendary 9-speed spirit pill. It can instantly restore one's real elemental energy. It's like having more than one life for me. There are also the 7 Revolution Soul Gathering pills. I've heard that this item can blow life into a dead body. Is it true? Senior brother Yi is very generous. I had only heard about these elixirs. I hadn't seen them until now. The disciples of the Qianyu faction cheered after obtaining so many immortality pills. These pills were of no use for Yi Shiwen. He had also refined some high-quality immortality pills which were useless to him now. However, these were rare treasures for these people. After all, the Yiyuan school wasn't a Colossus establishment. So most of the resources were inclined only towards the true disciples. Many disciples of the Yiyuan school had become very envious of these disciples of Qianyu faction, as they saw them obtaining these pills from afar. The Qianyu faction had certainly obtained Yiyuan school's support for development because of Yi Shiwen. However, they had still maintained the rules which they had fixed at the time when Yi Shiwen had established it. So they still hired only elites. In fact, it was quite difficult for an average person to get recruited. Therefore, they still had around 1,000 people only. Even after 10 years of development. The only change which had occurred in these years was that only the elite experts at small complete level of Xiantian realm were eligible to become a member of the Qianyu faction. There were others who also wanted to join. However, they didn't have a chance. So they all regretted why they didn't join the Qianyu faction at that time. They wouldn't have had to watch these people of Qianyu faction obtain such great benefits from the sidelines if they had joined the faction as well. Then, Yi Shiwen did the most surprising thing. He grabbed the spirit energies from the sky with some unfathomable power, and majestically instilled it into the Qianyu Peak. Suddenly, a lot of disciples who were stuck at the bottleneck and were unable to make the breakthroughs, took the advantage of this golden opportunity, and began to make breakthroughs one after another. This was an extremely rare opportunity for them. Many disciples of the Qianyu faction had suddenly begun to make breakthroughs. Even people like Yi Kongming weren't an exception either. The spirit energies were present in ample amount on the Qianyu Peak since the beginning, and Yi Shiwen also had done a lot of preparations before he had left. However, how could that old Yi Shiwen be compared with the current one? The current Yi Shiwen had straightaway grabbed the spirit energies, and had placed them here. Yi Shiwen's cultivation level realm had reached the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm, and his strength could be compared with that of a peak expert of the initial stage of the sage realm. So there was obviously no comparison between the current Yi Shiwen and the old one. Everyone sat cross-legged, and began to make breakthroughs since they had obtained such a rare opportunity. Master! A figure suddenly arrived flying from afar. He was dressed up in a scholar's attire. His entire body had a scholarly air to it. It turned out to be that book demon, Yi Shu, whom Yi Shiwen had freed. Yi Shu was very excited to see Yi Shiwen. After all, Yi Shiwen had returned after 10 years. He was very grateful to Yi Shiwen. After all, he would have still been a small book demon struggling inside that library and fighting for his survival if Yi Shiwen hadn't brought him out. How he could have obtained the prowess he now possessed if Yi Shiwen hadn't done that? His status on the Qianyu Peak was second only to the Yi family. He was the leader appointed by Yi Shiwen. The disciples of Qianyu faction also had a huge respect for him. However, he hadn't thought of having such life in the past. His demonic body was a book written on loyalty. His personality and character was derived on the characteristics described in this book. This was the reason why Yi Shiwen was also assured that he could entrust Qianyu in his capable hands. You seem to have worked hard this entire time. Yi Shiwen nodded. He then let out a smile and spoke. No, not at all. I haven't worked hard. Yi Shu promptly shook his head and replied. How could the life he had lived in the last 10 years be considered as exhausting in comparison to his life before? The people of the Yuan school saw that several formidable auras were fluctuating on top of Qianyu Peak. After all, several hundred people were making breakthroughs together in one day. Yi Shiwen had also returned from outside. Moreover, the news that he had brought great amounts of immortality pills for helping the disciples of Qianyu faction in making breakthroughs had spread throughout the Yuan school at a very fast speed. And this had increased Yi Shiwen's importance even more in Yuan school. In fact, this had made him even more of a legend. Everyone had seen that a great expert like Yi Shiwen was there to keep watch. Even the Qi state's invasion had been thwarted for the time being. So they were a bit relaxed since they had such a great expert to keep watch. Yi Shiwen met the man with whom his elder sister was going to get married. He looked like an ordinary young man. He possessed strength of truth level. He certainly wasn't the most glamorous one among the many truth level disciples of the Yuan school. Yi Shiwen had learnt that this man had chased his sister for 10 years, and had managed to arouse some feelings inside her after his non-stop attempts. So, Yi Shiwen was also quite happy for his sister. The so-called, it is easy to find priceless treasures and quite difficult to get a lover. The news that Yuan school had managed to stop the Qi state's allied force had spread widely, and it had caused a huge sensation throughout the 10 countries of the southeast region. Everyone knew that more than half of the southeast region had collapsed under the formidable offensive of the Qi state's allied forces. Several countries which were outside the territory of the Qi state had surrendered to them. However, they had only surrendered on the surface since the Qi state had risen extremely quickly in recent times. However, these countries hadn't made genuine surrenders. However, the Qi state had swept away the other countries at a very fast speed. And no country had been able to stop them in such a short time. However, the Qi state had to suffer loss whilst facing the Yuan school in the Great Yu state. Moreover, many of their semi-sage experts had gotten defeated in one breath. Yi Shiwen's name had become very famous in the 10 countries of the southeast region. A dozen of more semi-sage experts had appeared like weaklings in front of him, and they had sustained serious injuries by one move of his. Such strength had scared everyone. The situation had appeared rather clear initially, but it had gradually changed and had become blurred. The imperial capital of the Great Yu state had been surrounded by the army in large numbers. The city's matrix formation was already on the verge of a collapse. Two figures were fighting fiercely in the sky above the imperial capital. Rumble. One of them was clad in an imperial robe. He was skinny, and had white beard and mustache. His face exposed pain and suffering. His robe was drenched in blood. One of his hands had been broken and rendered useless. His opponent was a young man clad in red-colored robe. He possessed blade-like sharp facial features. His eyebrows were sharp, and stretched into his temples, like a pair of swords. His dark red pupils exposed a crazed look. He let out a strange demonic smile from the corner of his mouth. Both of them were sage experts in reality. Big black chunks of space had been cracked open in the sky by their stunning fight. It was a terrifying scene to watch. Old man, I had given you an opportunity, but you didn't give it importance. So die. That red-robed young man laughed in a frantic manner. He then unleashed the red-colored star power from his hands. The old man in the imperial robe couldn't withstand such force. His protective layer of real elemental energy got ripped apart by this attack. His body couldn't resist it, and got split into two halves in the air. And the shower of blood swirled about. Ancestor. Countless experts of the imperial clan shouted in grief. This man was their biggest hope. He was also their hidden trump card, a senior expert of the sage realm. The imperial clan of the Great Yu state had stood steadily in the region for so many years, because they secretly had the support of this sage expert. However, they helplessly watched him being cut into two halves in the sky at this time. Their only hope had been ripped apart. And they felt that the entire world had landed into darkness. The red-hot blood splashed out on the face of that red-robed young man. But he didn't feel disgusted by this. On the contrary, he seemed pleased in a crazy way. In fact, it seemed as if he was enjoying the taste of blood. His dreadful blood-red aura suddenly surged out of his body and swept across the entire imperial capital. Chapter 479. Bang! The dreadful and bloody energy swept across. The entire space fluctuated, and ripples proliferated in all directions. The endless void had been ripped apart in a flash like a picture scroll. It looked extremely frightening. Massive scarlet waves swept out. Everyone in the imperial capital had a very depressing feeling in their hearts. So much so that they wanted to vomit blood. Guys, we must go all out. We anyway don't have a way out. This young master in blood-red clothes is a lunatic. He will slaughter everyone if he manages to capture the city. Someone shouted loudly. This young master in blood-red clothes was quite famous in the entire southeast region. He would slaughter the entire city whenever he appeared in the battlefield, especially if the opposite party dared to resist. In fact, many forces had surrendered because of the fear of getting slaughtered by this crazy killing machine. This so-called young master in blood-red clothes was indeed a lunatic. So it would be of no use to surrender afterwards, since he would slaughter everyone in the city if they showed any resistance. Everyone in the imperial capital stood united at this time. All of them knew that it would be a dead end for them if this person managed to capture the city. And they wouldn't get a single chance of survival if that came to happen. One must know that this young master in blood-red clothes was fighting alone at this time. However, he had several million soldiers of the Allied forces stationed behind him. The crumbling defensive matrix formation of the imperial capital had once again gotten some support since everyone had gotten united. Then a myriad of divine tools shot up in the sky in quick succession and headed towards that young master in blood-red clothes. And a grandiose wave of divine tools was formed as a result. It blotted out the sky and covered the earth. It was overwhelming, and its influence could scare a person. The murderous auras surged up into the sky, and endless clouds got torn apart. Qi Gaoyang was also one in this united group of thousands of warriors. He was merely an expert at the pinnacle of Xiantian realm. So, the people of the imperial capital didn't consider him as a formidable expert either. However, he didn't have any other option at this time. His family and friends were behind him. So he didn't have any other way. The entire city would be slaughtered if they got defeated. He nervously looked on, as that massive wave of divine tools filled the entire sky. The success or failure was hinged on this one attack. And he couldn't afford to lose. However, that blood-red-clothed young master didn't even look fazed in the face of this attack. He snorted coldly, and suddenly stamped his foot. Then, scarlet ripples emerged one after another, and proceeded to crash into the incoming divine tools. Murderous aura flickered in those divine tools as they released the divine beams. These beams then condensed into a group, and pounded on those layers of ripples one after another. However, that young master in blood-red clothes hadn't even moved back. He had merely taken a single step, and had managed to produce these ripples which had come to collide with those divine tools. Bang! 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 Those divine tools were shattered at first impact by his scarlet ripples, as if they were made of glass. They broke down into small pieces and disintegrated in their entirety. Poochie! 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 Countless experts in the imperial capital spouted blood from their mouths in quick succession. Those divine tools had been interlinked with their minds. So these people were also affected when those divine tools shattered. Qi Gao Yang's entire body shivered violently. He felt a strange taste in his mouth. Then he spouted blood from his mouth as well. And everything became fuzzy before his eyes. It seemed as if he had sustained serious injuries. And he fell down as a result. The attack wasn't directly aimed at him. However, it had carried an extremely terrifying force. The scarlet ripples grew more and more thick. Even the pseudo-sage tools had begun to break. Thick layers of blood clouds formed in the sky above the imperial capital. It looked exceptionally frightening. The blood-red-clothed young master sneered. Audacious. The bloody clouds became even thicker under his feet. Blood-red lightning was also brewing and flickering inside the clouds. Rumble. Seemingly endless blood and energies condensed into blood spears inside those bloody clouds, and swept down. And countless people in the imperial capital were nailed to the ground by those blood spears. The entire imperial capital had been densely covered with blood spears in a split second. Loud screams reverberated everywhere. And the people of the imperial capital had been killed within a split second. Everyone had been killed in a flash. The semi-sage experts had been no exception to this. They couldn't escape either. A powerful sage expert was enough to suppress an entire area in the southeast region. A terrifying strength had vividly manifested on the body of that young master in blood-red clothes. The sage realm was the beginning of transcending the mortal world and becoming an extraordinary expert. Therefore, sage experts were significantly different from the experts at lower levels. The essence and blood of those people had been absorbed by those blood spears. Afterwards, those spears converged back inside those blood clouds below that man's feet. Then the blood clouds fluxed into his body. He seemingly felt very comfortable as the blood-red rays of light emitted from his body. In fact, they faintly looked like blood-red scales. However, his cheerful expression suddenly turned sinister and dreadful at this time. And his aura had flourished even more. Young brother, there's a bad news. The blood-red clothed young master was still enjoying those scarlet energies. However, an old man clad in black clothes suddenly arrived treading on a rainbow light. The people who had gone to the Yuan school have failed. I've heard that a powerful person has arrived there. That old man was clearly older than the young master in blood-red clothes. However, he still willingly saluted to the young master. He might be a powerful sage expert. That old man thought for a moment before he added, Sage realm. The face of that young master in blood-red clothes exposed a strange and demonic smile. In fact, his smile looked a bit crazed and twisted. How much blood and essence do these ordinary people have? However, killing a sage expert will be equal to killing 1 billion of these ants. I thought it would be better if we could kill them as soon as possible. Our Qi State's army has certainly acquired a lot of area. However, we still have lesser time. These people are far from truly surrendering to us. And those secretly ambitious people may retaliate if we get slowed down here. That old man said worriedly. And it will be a big trouble for us if some remnant old sage experts return back. He was certainly worried. The big forces of other countries also had the support of sage experts just like their Qi state. Those sage experts would often travel outside. However, this didn't mean that they didn't care. It was only that they were thousands of miles away from their homes, and the Qi state had caught them off guard this time. The Qi state would gain influence over the entire southeast region if they could pacify the entire southeast region rather quickly. Those old sage experts may return at some point, but the Qi state wouldn't be in a difficult situation if they were able to achieve this target. In addition, they also had a lot of sage experts here, so they didn't need to worry. However, those sage experts would get the news, and they would quickly return if the Qi state's footsteps were to get obstructed here. And the consequences would be too disastrous in that case. There's nothing to be afraid of. In fact, it's good that they have happened to rebel at the right time. I want to perfect the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor power technique. And I still lack a lot of essence and blood. I was only worried that I wouldn't get an excuse to kill them. That young master in blood-red clothes let out an evil smile and said, "Anyway, these ordinary mortals are like ants. It doesn't matter how many of them are killed. I will kill those old fogies of sage level if they dare to return. And my martial power will advance by leaps and bounds after I've killed several sage experts. Then, I will prevail over everyone in the sex big competition when the time comes. And I wouldn't need to see that bastard's face after that happens. That bastard's origin and aptitude are worse than mine. Why has everything been pressed upon my head?" That young master in blood-red clothes spoke up. It wasn't clear where his train of thoughts had drifted while he was speaking these words. That old man who was beside him had become somewhat embarrassed. He didn't know how to interact with him. "I am going to humiliate that bastard after I've perfected the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor power technique. And I want you to see whose performance is best. Who deserves to be the heir?" The complexion of that young master in blood-red clothes had turned grim as he had continued. "Come follow me. Mobilize the army. Let's go to that Yuan school. We won't leave anyone alive on the way either. I want that guy to come out and beg me for death in person." The news of Imperial Capital's collapse had spread throughout the entire Great Yu State in a flash. It obviously caused a huge sensation in the entire southeast region. And this suddenly overshadowed the sensational news of Yi Shiwen's return as well. Everyone had been slaughtered in the entire Imperial Capital. No one had been left alive. Moreover, the essence and blood of those people had been absorbed, and their corpses had been left in an extremely ugly condition. However, some people had seen this fight from afar on that day. It had happened very quickly, and had been accomplished very easily. The Imperial Capital's defense couldn't withstand for long. The sage expert of the Imperial clan of the Great Yu State had been ripped apart. He simply didn't have the power to fight back. Suddenly, the entire southeast region had become frightened because of this. No one could picture this news in their head. After all, a sage expert was unable to save a city. And this news began to spread out next day. The Blood Spirit sect had been hesitant at first. However, they had almost immediately surrendered to the Qi state's allied forces. The Great Yu State had 5 big forces. The Heavenly Wind Hall and the Blood Spirit sect had already surrendered to the Qi state's army. The Imperial clan and the Drifting Cloud City had been collectively slaughtered. In fact, their orthodox teachings had been severed as well. So only Yuan School was left now. In everyone's opinion, a weak force like the Yuan School couldn't stop the footsteps of the Qi state's allied forces. It didn't matter even if they had a sage expert to keep watch. The Imperial clan of the Great Yu State had a sage expert as well. However, everyone had seen what happened in the end. They had been slaughtered to the last man. Moreover, the Qi state's allied forces had several sage experts. How would one person be able to compete with so many people? It would be like courting death. The forces of those countries who hadn't surrendered, yet had begun to leave. They had only 2 options. Either to surrender to the Qi state's allied forces, or to leave the southeast region and go to some other place. They could also take refuge in True Martial University if they wanted. They might lose their thousands-of-year-old power and influence as a result. But it would still be better than getting slaughtered. Many sects that didn't wish to become Qi state's pawn, or didn't wish to get slaughtered had begun contacting the other forces outside the Southeast region. Southeast region was the entire world for ordinary people. However, it was a different matter for these deep-rooted forces. And then, another bad news spread out soon after that. The Qi state's army had arrived. Moreover, they had slaughtered everyone on the way. Initially, the Qi state's army had slaughtered everyone in those areas where they had faced resistance, and those who had surrendered to them in the beginning had been spared. However, things had changed now. The Qi state's army had started to massacre indiscriminately in order to increase the pace of their march. So they would slaughter everyone who would come in their way. There was no reason or logic behind this massacre, and everyone had begun to tremble with fear at the thought of this. Many people even decided to fight till the last drop of their blood. After all, they were going to die regardless of whether they would resist or not. Then, another news was transmitted by the Qi state's allied forces. They would continue to slaughter people unless Yi Shiwen would agree to come out alone with his hands tied and ready to die. Chapter 480. The high-level experts of the Qinyu faction had gathered inside the discussion hall of the Qinyu faction. This hall was located on the Qinyu Peak, and they were discussing about the measures that should be taken to deal with the current situation. They have adopted a very malicious strategy. Yi Feng pounded his fist on the table and said. He looked extremely angry. Everyone could see what they were up to. They wanted to force Yi Shiwen to come out and seek his death voluntarily, since it would take too long for that sage expert to reach the Yuan school and kill everyone at his current marching speed. They obviously hadn't arrived yet. In fact, they were advancing at a leisurely pace and were whimsically killing anyone that happened to appear in their way. Wouldn't these people hate the Qi allied forces when their time would come? They would. However, they would hate Yi Shiwen even more. They would think that Yi Shiwen was the reason for this calamity, since he had attracted the enemies. However, they had forgotten that it would have been very difficult for them to escape this killing spree, irrespective of Yi Shiwen's choices. Such was the psychology of ordinary people. They want to force young brother Yi to come out and seek his death voluntarily. Yi Rushua's small face had turned serious as she spoke. Yeah. More and more news is coming that many people have started to blame young brother Yi for this situation. They want him to go and beg for forgiveness. Yan Qiling's complexion turned dignified as he added. He had been in charge of Qinyu faction's management this entire time. His presence had also become very strong because of this. In fact, it was very similar to that of a powerful person. So there was obviously a difference between his current personality and the one he possessed when he was younger and relatively inexperienced man. These people should die in a merciless manner. Yi Shu spoke in anger. He believed that Yi Shiwen was the most gracious person one could ever find. And these people had dared to criticize Yi Shiwen? It was nothing less than suicide in his opinion. Did everyone think that these people were stupid? No, they weren't stupid. And it wasn't that they didn't know the difference between right and wrong either. They were merely afraid of getting killed by the Qi allied forces. They couldn't dare to oppose the Qi allied forces. So they could only dare to blame someone who stood on their own side. And Yi Shiwen had been deemed responsible for this disastrous situation as a result. Yi Shiwen was sitting on the throne of the Lord. He was silent. He had also heard some of those criticisms. However, he hadn't paid any attention to them. He wasn't a pedantic person who would give value to these small issues. And he wasn't someone who would willingly go and seek death because of the criticisms of those people. These people would accuse him more and more as time would progress. However, he wouldn't agree with them. He instead believed that the best option was to kill that blood-red-clothed young master. And this was also the best method to give a tight slap in the faces of those people. Yi Shiwen had gradually heard some of the matters surrounding the Qi allied force during these days. So he had also developed some idea about them. The Qi state's army hadn't been so powerful at the start. However, it had been said that the Qi state's sage expert had returned, and he had brought several sage experts along with him. And the most famous among them was that blood-red-clothed young master. But nobody knew his name. So, they simply called him the blood-red-clothed young man. People would consider themselves fortunate if they were attacked by the other sage experts. But this blood-red-clothed young master had slaughtered entire cities wherever he had appeared. Moreover, he had done it without any hesitation. It seemed as if he was practicing some evil power technique, and it appeared as if he would use other people's blood and essence for carrying out his practice. It was reported that he was at the initial stage of the sage realm. However, he possessed extremely tyrannical strength. In fact, an ordinary expert of the initial stage of the sage realm couldn't stand up to him. That sage expert of the imperial clan had been torn apart by him. Moreover, he had several sage experts by his side. But Yi Shiwen was all alone. So things didn't look optimistic for him. The opposite party wanted to exploit this volatile situation. In fact, they might even be considering that they would focus everyone's hatred on Yi Shiwen after the post-war domination of the Great Yu state. Time would gradually come to pass, and everyone would gradually begin to believe that Yi Shiwen was the one responsible for this disaster. Those traitors of the Heavenly Wind Hall and the Blood Spirit sect are definitely trying to add fuel to the fire by inciting a rebellion against Yi Shiwen. Yan Qiling spoke with a trace of extreme anger in his tone. These five big forces had always been vigilant of each other. However, they also had each other's cooperation. In fact, they would often join hands against the foreign forces. But this rumor had spread far and wide in such a short time. And that wouldn't have been possible unless these two forces hadn't cooperated. This was the so-called, the mighty dragon is no match for the native serpent on its hunting ground. The Qi allied forces undoubtedly had tyrannical strength. However, they still weren't as powerful as the local forces when it came to such matters. It seems that we will have to punish the culprits in order to give warning to the others. We must uproot those who are most excited, and are willing acting as the pawns. Yi Shiwen callously suggested. The Qi allied forces were quite formidable, and that blood-red-clothed young man was extremely tyrannical. However, it seemed that the people who were jumping in excitement had forgotten that Yi Shiwen wasn't a weakling either. Let's find the people who are the most excited about this rumor, and then let's kill them. Yi Shiwen stood up from his throne as he spoke in a strong voice. Being manipulated by the enemy at each and every step wasn't the solution. And Yi Shiwen didn't care about the criticisms of those stupid people. In fact, these rumors had helped him to come up with another idea on the contrary. The Qi coalition had a reputation of an allied army, because various forces had joined them. In fact, some among those entities were willing to throw their lives for the sake of the Qi state. However, some of them had been forced to join the coalition. Therefore, they must expose the people who had joined the Qi coalition willingly. And they must punish the said people to set an example for others. The rest of the things would become very simple after that. Hand over this task to me. Yan Qiling vouched for this task by beating his chest. He was certainly much inferior to Yi Shiwen in terms of strength. However, his familiarity with the local information networks was much better than Yi Shiwen's. Anyway, there wasn't enough time to gather this information. Yi Shiwen raised his head and looked up at the sky. His facial expression looked firm. More than 10 streamers of light streaked across the sky over the Yuan school a few days later. A few people arrived, and the Yuan school turned lively once again. That was because the people who had arrived were none other than the disciples of the true martial university. Moreover, they were being led by Qi Fifan. Yi Shiwen had sent a letter to Qi Fifan after he had saved the Yuan school from getting besieged. And Qi Fifan and the others had finally arrived as well at this time. In addition, many of the former powerful disciples of the Yuan school had also arrived this time. Huang Luochen and Shuiyin Luo were amongst them as well. Qi Fifan had also made a huge progress in these years, just like Yi Shiwen. In fact, he had already entered the sage realm. Yi Shiwen had tyrannical strength, and he could even take down an outstanding expert who went against the heaven's will. However, it was countless times more difficult for him to make the breakthroughs when compared to an ordinary person. A mysterious old man clad in black clothes was also present there. He had an obscure aura. In fact, the depth of his aura was unfathomable. Even Yi Shiwen couldn't see through his cultivation level. Qi Fifan mentioned that this old man was an elder of the metropolis Martial Peak. He had specially been assigned to Qi Fifan for the sake of his protection. This old man would cultivate with Qi Fifan under normal circumstances. However, he could also protect Qi Fifan when required. Yi Shiwen sighed with emotion. The metropolis martial peak had a very profound and dreadful background. After all, it was the inheritance of the Supreme Lord himself. Moreover, an extremely profound sage-level elder had been assigned to protect a disciple. Such generosity wasn't available to everyone in the sect. Then, the thought about his own hidden star peak appeared in his mind. It only had a few disciples. However, he didn't think about it any further. He didn't know whether he should even ask or not. In fact, he couldn't think of anybody whom he could invite. However, Yi Shiwen was mostly surprised to see Yang Wenjun and Deng Shui Xian. Both of them had become tired of staying at the hidden star peak, since they had hardly gotten an opportunity to come out of it. Therefore, they immediately came along with Qi Fifan when he asked them. Presently, there were 5 sage experts present in the Yiyuan school as a result. And this count included Qi Fifan since he had already entered the initial stage of the sage realm. Moreover, Huang Luochen and the other semi-sage experts were also present. So, they probably weren't any lesser in number when compared to the team of that blood-red-clothed young master. The high-level experts of the Yiyuan school became exceptionally excited when they heard this news. The Yiyuan school had been shrouded in a very sorrowful mood for some time. In fact, even the presence of an expert like Yi Shiwen who possessed divine powers couldn't make any difference in their mood. He was undoubtedly very ferocious. However, he was alone. How he could contend against several sage experts. However, things had changed now since many sage experts had arrived. So their confidence had increased enormously as well. Everyone thought that southeast region was only a small portion of the southern region, and couldn't possibly have more sage experts than the true martial university. The true martial university obviously had many sage experts. It was just that the true martial university didn't wish to interfere in the disputes among these countries. After all, the true martial university wasn't seeking worldly dominance. Moreover, the country that would win and gain the top position would have to give ample resources to the true martial university. Therefore, the true martial university didn't care who was at the top. The true martial university didn't wish to interfere. However, they didn't stop their disciples from interfering either. After all, the ways of the world is always hard to avoid. A huge pile of bonfire had been ignited late at night on top of the full moon peak. This peak was located in the depths of the Yiyuan school. A huge flood dragon was hanging on a rack above that bonfire. Its skin had been peeled off, and it was being roasted on the rack. The yellow-colored fat was constantly dripping into the huge bonfire. And the pitter-patter crackling sound would be heard whenever those drops of fat would fall into the bonfire. Yi Shiwen had killed this young flood dragon on the ancient road. It had merely been a young flood dragon at that time. However, it had the body of a fully grown dragon. So it was very huge. It had frozen when Yi Shiwen had put it into the heavenly source mirror. So, it was still fresh. In fact, it seemed as if Yi Shiwen had killed him only recently. Everyone was drinking and having fun because of this rare get-together. But, how they could get drunk considering their martial power. So they were drinking even more fearlessly. However, nobody was aiming to get drunk since that would be nonsensical. After all, they weren't drunkards. Moreover, there was something important going on in their bodies. And they might botch this process if they got drunk. Gee! I hadn't thought that I would get to eat a flood dragon's meat in my entire lifetime. Deng Shui Xian was holding some unknown divine tool in her small hand. She cut apart a piece from the huge body of that flood dragon, and put it into her mouth. And she let out a wah-wah sound as she put that sizzling hot piece of meat into her mouth. However, she still didn't wish to stop chewing. She had unknowingly revealed her foodie nature at this time. Everyone nodded in unison. Flood dragons hadn't vanished from this world, much unlike the real dragons. However, they were still quite rare. So it was hard to find them, let alone eat their meat. Anyway, it wasn't as if these people were eating donkeys' meat. After all, wasn't a flood dragon a dragon too? It must be mentioned that such frightening creatures took birth in the legendary realm. And they could easily surpass the great sage realm after they had reached adulthood. In fact, a fully grown flood dragon could turn the entire southern region upside down. But it wasn't nearly a creature from the legends. Several other people also began to attack the meat when they saw this. That flood dragon's body was quite huge. It was enough to satisfy everyone's hunger. In fact, some of it might still be left after that. It could be said that the so-called semi-sage or sage experts might not get another opportunity to eat a flood dragon's meat. So nobody wanted to miss this chance. Yi Shiwen couldn't help himself either. He too ate to his heart's content. His taste buds suddenly felt different. The flood dragon's meat contained a great amount of vitality, and it could clean people's meridians. Chapter 481. Chapter 481. Kill those who are most excited. The vitality of a young flood dragon of legendary realm wouldn't have a big effect on the current Yi Shiwen. However, it would have astonishing effects an expert below the legendary realm, or even an expert of the legendary realm. His niece and nephew unceasingly emitted clear energies from their bodies after they ate mouthful of oil and meat. They had gotten the access and control over their meridians within no time. Then their meridians opened up, and they advanced into the Xiantian realm. Yi Shiwen had no choice but to sigh with emotion. He never had such a good opportunity back then. He had to work hard and had made many plans for obtaining the Xiantian Dawn in order to enter the Xiantian realm. Perhaps this is what we call, the younger generation reaps fruit from the trees which were planted by their ancestors. However, he didn't dislike this thing. After all, hadn't he also enjoyed so many of such small benefits? For example, how could he have practiced the Xiantian cultivation technique, bright jade technique, if he didn't have a father who was an elder? Young brother, you will have to kill several such flood dragons for me in the future. Of course, it would be better if you can kill real dragons. Deng Shui Xian spoke while eating a mouthful of greasy meat. Yi Shiwen suddenly broke into cold sweat. What the hell is this request? Kill several of them? I was lucky that I had encountered a young flood dragon then. I might have been chased and hunted down if it were an adult dragon. It wasn't a sensible idea to say the least of it. However, it seemed as if Deng Shui Xian had spoken this in a careless manner. She then began to talk to his older sister in a passionate manner. Her temperament was similar to that of his sister's. So, she had become friends with his sister quite quickly, and was now talking to her rather energetically. However, she was talking with a pure heart, and wasn't speaking any empty words. There are men who hit it off well even when they see each other for the first time. And they help each other even though they have just met. Then, why couldn't the same be true for women? The high-level experts of the Yiyuan Peak would eat the flood dragon's meat, and would then exercise their martial power to digest it. Most of them had the profound strength of Te legendary realm. So it wasn't that they would explode from the excess of energy. However, their complexions had turned ugly in their attempts to containing the burst of energy. They had seen sage experts, and that was something they couldn't see on a normal day. They considered a sage expert to be some sort of a god. However, these sage experts were also yelling and fighting over the meal at this time. It seemed as if they weren't different from these other people. They knew that one wouldn't care about gods or demons after having cultivated to such an extent. And they also knew that sage experts were far more powerful than them. However, it wasn't useful even if they knew this, because they couldn't reach this realm. A sage expert had such dreadful fighting strength, that even one such expert could easily force a country into submission. So the higher-ups of the Yiyuan school didn't have any choice but to be vigilant. However, that old man clad in black clothes didn't seem interested in all this. He was keeping watch over Qi Fifan, and didn't seem to be moving. People tried to persuade him, but he didn't touch the flood dragon's meat. Qi Fifan had mentioned that this old man was the servant of the Supreme Lord's family, when he used to be a kid. Afterwards, he had entered the true martial university along with the Supreme Lord. He had been loyal and devoted since the beginning. Therefore, he had been sent with Qi Fifan's group this time. However, this also showed how much the Supreme Lord cared about Qi Fifan. This was a big reason behind the fact that Qi Fifan's cultivation had made unceasing breakthroughs in such a short time. Yi Shiwen was somewhat envious of his status. He thought about the hidden star peak. It only had a very few disciples. He wouldn't have entered the hidden star peak if there had been any margin for a different option at that time. And he might have been in a different situation today if that had come to happen. Young Yi, what are you planning to do? Qi Fifan had become angry when he had seen the miserable situation of the Yi Yuan school and the Great Yu State. He wasn't an outsider like Yi Shiwen. He had been born and brought up in the Great Yu State. Therefore, his sentiments for the Great Yu State were beyond Yi Shiwen's imagination. They're not interested in a direct and decisive battle. So we will also accompany them in this game and have fun. Yi Shiwen coldly replied. We will eliminate those who are most excited. We must first uproot the most loyal pawns they have gathered. And Qi Fifan also harbored deep hatred for those pawns of the Qi coalition. Time passed day by day, and the Qi coalition was still slaughtering everyone. In fact, they slaughtered the entire cities and villages wherever they went. That blood-red-clothed young master was also practicing the evil technique, and he needed time to digest the absorbed essence and blood. Therefore, they weren't forging ahead at a quick pace. The accusations made on Yi Shiwen's name were also growing. In fact, many people had also begun to blame him for this calamity. However, not many people had the courage to criticize that blood-red-clothed young master. The Yi Yuan school had maintained silence on the criticisms of the outside world. They didn't say anything. On this day, the shadow of a person appeared outside the Great Wu State's Silver Light Mountain village. Bang! A huge explosion occurred. The shadow of that person suddenly stamped his foot and released waves of golden ripples. These ripples then proliferated in the surroundings. He was flying in the air like an ancient god, and his eyes looked ice cold. The ground collapsed and the space shattered wherever those golden ripples went. Who has dared to enter our Silver Light Mountain village? A loud shout came from inside the Silver Light Mountain village as many tyrannical semi-sage experts rushed out. Many legendary experts were also present. They too possessed profound cultivation and vigorous auras. Each of them had tyrannical aura which could scare anyone. Yi Shiwen faintly smiled and didn't say anything. Those golden ripples then swept across like waves of the sea and flooded the Silver Light Mountain village. Rumble! The space got shattered, and buildings were destroyed in a split second wherever those golden sea waves went. And those semi-sage experts were sent flying as soon as the waves struck them. Who is this man? He dares to rush inside the Silver Light Mountain village? Someone shouted since they had been stunned by this incredible battle scene. Many of the experts who were in the vicinity of the Silver Light Mountain village rushed over to see. They saw that a golden figure had arrived in the sky above the Silver Light Mountain village. This individual looked like a golden god of war. And these people became extremely surprised when they saw this. Who didn't know that the Silver Light Mountain village had turned arrogant and despotic, having made their surrender to the Qi state? In fact, they were brimming with arrogance. So, who would dare to offend them? Let alone arriving at their door to fight in this way. That man, is that Yi Shiwen? I've heard of him, and I have also seen his portrait. It's genuinely him. I'm not mistaken about this. What? He's Yi Shiwen? Isn't he guarding the Yi Yuan school? How he has appeared here? Everyone is saying that he has transformed since we last saw him on that day he became famous on the Demon Island. Only 10 years have passed, but even the semi-sage experts don't look to be a match for him. Some people became extremely shocked as they recognized Yi Shiwen. More and more people rushed over there to see this astonishing scene. Who the hell are you? A senior semi-sage expert of the Silver Light Mountain village shouted. Those golden waves unleashed by Yi Shiwen's step had nearly blasted him to death. You are Yi Shiwen? An expert of the Silver Light Mountain village recognized Yi Shiwen and became extremely shocked at this realization. Yi Shiwen had become widely popular in the entire southeast region of late. So they also knew about him. The experts of the Silver Light Mountain village were one of the main forces that had besieged the Yi Yuan school. So, wouldn't they have felt terrified to see him at their doorstep this time? Finally, someone has recognized me. Yi Shiwen faintly laughed and said, Yi Shiwen, what do you want to do? That powerful senior expert of the semi-sage realm tried to act calm and asked, I will do everything which you were trying to do. You have willingly become the pawns of those people of the Qi state. So, you should have been prepared for this day. Yi Shiwen coldly laughed. Today, I will prove that your Silver Light Mountain Village's fate has come to an end. Everyone suddenly understood what was going on. The people of the Silver Light Mountain Village had besieged the Yuan school. And now, they were happily acting as the pawns of the Qi state. So it was time for them to face the retaliation. Yi Shiwen finished speaking. Then he slowly walked towards those people of the Silver Light Mountain Village. And his imposing aura was becoming more and more severe with every step that he was taking. The golden waves under his feet surged up violently, and he appeared like the reincarnation of an ancient god. Rumble. His dreadful imposing aura swept out. Those legendary experts couldn't resist the terrifying might, and fell onto their knees. Their legs had broken on the spot. Yi Shiwen didn't restrain his murderous aura. In fact, he set it free without any hesitation. And it spread everywhere in the sky. Those onlookers also retreated several steps. They didn't dare to come close. They couldn't come close to that killing intention. They were trembling with fear. Yi Shiwen, don't dare to act too insolent. Our Silver Light Mountain Village also has a senior sage ancestor. So you won't be benefited if you killed us. That senior semi-sage realm expert shouted. I see. Then I'll let him come for me. I wish to ask him what he was up to this entire time. Yi Shiwen laughed disdainfully. Nobody can be compared with you when it comes to talking too much. You were jumping in joy after you became the pawns. Many people have died because of you. So it's the time to take back the debt of blood from you. These people of the Silver Light Mountain Village had been jumping in joy since they had gotten the support of the Qi state. And they had obtained enormous benefits because of that. However, they would also have to be the first ones to face the retaliation since they were on the front line. Yi Shiwen, don't you dare to be hypocritical before me. You should have gone in front of that young master, and asked for your death with your hands tied if you genuinely cared about the lives of those ordinary mortals. A person of the Silver Light Mountain Village interrupted Yi Shiwen by saying this. Those people? Yi Shiwen coldly laughed. They make too much noise. That blood-red clothed young master can kill people. But don't forget that I can also do that. Countless experts became numb as they heard this. A chill ran down their spines. It wasn't easy to deal with this man who was present before their eyes. He was no pushover. He had already become widely famous once because of his killing sprees on the Demon Island. So, it was rather funny that many people still thought that it would be easy to bully him. People hadn't dared to provoke that blood-red clothed young master. Instead, they had blamed Yi Shiwen for this chaos. Many people even had ulterior motives, and wanted these words to reach the ears of the Qi coalition so that they could survive. However, they hadn't thought that Yi Shiwen could also dare to kill people. Just like that blood-red clothed young master. How could a person who had released such a statement be treated with leniency? Perhaps some people were going to have a bad luck. People had previously thought that Yi Shiwen wouldn't say anything because of the criticism. However, it turned out that he simply didn't care about some random person's cry. These disciples of the Silver Light Mountain Village reacted in quick succession. They realized that this man before their eyes was also a god killer. Form a lineup. We must stop this guy. I have already informed the Great Qi Coalition. They are sending sage experts to kill this monster. That senior semi-sage expert shouted. That you're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.